I had not even recovered from my emergency C-section when my husband tossed divorce papers onto my hospital bed. He looked down at me and said, "You and that premature baby are just a burden to me." Then he flew to Dubai with his mistress. 9 years later, he showed up at my office demanding to meet his son. But when he learned exactly who my son was and what he owned, the color drained from his face and his knees hit the floor. I am Lauren, 34 years old, and my life changed forever in a sterile hospital room in Boston. Before I share how I turned the worst day of my life into an empire, tell me where you are watching from in the comments. Hit that like button and subscribe if you believe karma always collects its debts. The harsh fluorescent lights of the Boston Medical Center recovery room hummed with a low, irritating frequency. I was 25 years old, staring blankly at the ceiling tiles while the fresh staples in my abdomen burned with a hot, searing agony. Down the hall in the neonatal intensive care unit, my son Leo, born 6 weeks premature, was fighting for his life inside a plastic incubator. The rhythmic mechanical beep of his heart monitor was the only sound keeping me anchored to reality. I was terrified, exhausted, and desperately waiting for my husband to walk through the door and tell me everything was going to be fine. We had planned for this child, prayed for him, and now that he was here early and vulnerable, I needed my partner more than ever. When the door to my room finally pushed open, it was not a friendly nurse checking my vitals. It was not a compassionate doctor with a reassuring update on Leo and his underdeveloped lungs. It was Bradley, my husband of 3 years. He did not look like a man who had just become a father, or a man whose wife had nearly bled out on the operating table just hours earlier. Instead, he was wearing a perfectly tailored navy suit, holding a sleek leather briefcase, and checking his expensive watch with an air of profound impatience. The smell of his cologne filled the small room, masking the sharp scent of antiseptic. He did not walk to my bedside to hold my hand. He did not ask how I was managing the blinding physical pain. He did not ask if our tiny son was breathing on his own. He simply stopped at the foot of my bed, unlatched his briefcase with a loud click, and pulled out a thick manila envelope. With a casual flick of his wrist, he tossed it onto my lap. It landed softly against the thin hospital blanket, but the weight of it felt like a heavy anvil crushing my chest. "You and that baby are just a burden to me," Bradley said. His voice was flat, completely devoid of emotion, like he was canceling a gym membership rather than destroying a family. I stared at the envelope, my brain rendered sluggish by the heavy doses of pain medication and the sheer absurdity of the moment. "What is this?" I rasped, my throat dry and aching from the intubation tube they had removed earlier that morning. "Divorce papers," he stated, adjusting his silk tie in the reflection of the small mirror on the wall. I did not sign up for a life of suffocating diapers, massive hospital bills, and a wife who cries all the time. "Vanessa and I are leaving for Dubai tonight. I secured a highly paid senior consulting contract there. I suggest you sign those quickly so we do not have to drag this messy situation out in family court." "Dubai," I whispered, struggling to push myself up on my elbows. The monitors attached to my chest fluttered wildly as my heart rate spiked. "Bradley Leo is in the intensive care unit right now. He weighs barely 3 pounds. We have a mountain of medical debt piling up by the hour. You cannot just leave us here alone to deal with this." "Watch me," he sneered, turning his back toward the door. "Oh, and Lauren, do not bother trying to access the joint checking account. I am going to need startup capital for my new life." He walked out, the heavy wooden door clicking shut behind him, leaving me in a deafening, suffocating silence. The cruelty was so precise, so incredibly calculated, that for a full minute I could not even process how to inhale. He had abandoned his premature son and his bleeding wife without a single ounce of hesitation or remorse. I fumbled for my phone on the bedside table, ignoring the sharp, stabbing pain radiating through my core with every frantic movement. My fingers shook violently as I logged into our banking application. The screen loaded slowly, the blue circles spinning mockingly, before the numbers finally appeared on the glaring white display. Available balance $14.12. He had drained it completely. $48,500 was gone. Every cent we had saved for a house down payment, every dollar from our wedding gifts, the emergency fund we diligently built together, while I worked double shifts at the medical supply company. He had transferred it all to an offshore account in the United Arab Emirates. He had not just abandoned us, he had financially assassinated us to fund his luxurious new life with his mistress. I did not scream. I did not throw my phone against the blank hospital wall. A strange glacial calm washed over me. It was the raw survival instinct kicking in, burying the immense grief and replacing it with pure focus. I was 25, flat broke, physically broken, and drowning in medical debt. But as I stared at the $14 to my name, a fierce fire ignited. Bradley had left me absolutely nothing to lose. An hour later, the heavy door to my hospital room pushed open again. I braced myself, half expecting Bradley to return with another blow, but the tension in my chest unraveled when I saw my older sister Rebecca and her husband Andre. Andre was a senior partner at a top-tier corporate law firm in downtown Boston, an African-American man with a brilliant calculating mind. Andre was not the type to offer hollow platitudes or useless sympathy. He was a shark in a bespoke suit, a man who saw the world purely in terms of leverage, liabilities, and legal checkmates. When he saw my pale face, the tears I had refused to shed, and the divorce papers lying discarded on my lap, he did not offer a pitying hug. He pulled up a sterile vinyl hospital chair, opened his briefcase, and went straight to work. "Talk to me, Lauren." Andre said, his voice a steady, grounding baritone that cut right through the sterile panic of the hospital room. I handed him my phone, the banking application still open to the devastating balance of $14.12. He drained the joint account. $48,500. He left divorce papers right before he walked out. He said he is flying to Dubai tonight with Vanessa to start a new senior consulting contract. Rebecca covered her mouth, her eyes wide with horror as she looked from the phone to my bandaged abdomen. "Oh my God, Lauren, Leo needs round-the-clock care. The medical bills alone will bankrupt you." "Forget the bills for a second." Andre interrupted, his eyes narrowing as he scrutinized the transaction history on my phone screen. He tapped the glass a few times, his legal mind connecting the dots with ruthless efficiency. "Lauren, did he transfer this money directly to a bank account in the United Arab Emirates?" "Yes," I breathed, clutching the edges of my hospital gown. "He specifically said he needed it for startup capital for his new life." A slow, dangerous smile spread across Andrea's face. It was the look of an apex predator spotting a fatal, glaring weakness in its prey. "Bradley is an arrogant fool," Andre said, setting the phone down on my bedside table. "He thinks because it was a joint account, he had the legal right to simply empty it. But he just crossed state and international lines with misappropriated marital funds intended for medical care. He effectively hid shared assets in direct anticipation of a divorce filing." "What exactly does that mean for us?" I asked, wincing as another sharp wave of pain radiated from my surgical incision. "It means," Andre said, leaning forward and folding his hands, "that technically I can have federal authorities look into this as wire fraud. More importantly, the United Arab Emirates has incredibly strict moral and financial codes for expatriate work visas. If a prospective expat is flagged for pending financial fraud investigations, or if his assets are temporarily frozen by an American family court injunction, his precious work visa is dead on arrival. He will be stopped at customs, detained, deported, and lose his lucrative contract before he even unpacks his bags." "Do it!" Rebecca hissed, fiercely, pacing at the foot of my bed. "Call the police right now. Have him arrested at Logan Airport in front of his mistress." "No," I said, my voice shockingly clear and steady. Both of them stopped and looked at me. The heavy pain medication was wearing off, leaving me entirely lucid and hyper-aware of my reality. I looked down at the divorce papers resting on my legs. Bradley wanted to be entirely free of us. He had literally called my vulnerable son a burden. If I dragged him through court for the money, I would be legally tied to him for years. We would have to share custody. He would be forced to remain in Leo U.S. life, acting as a toxic, resentful ghost haunting our every single milestone. "I do not want the money," I said, looking directly into Andrea's eyes. "I want him gone. Permanently." Andre stared at me for a long moment, evaluating the cold steel in my gaze. He understood exactly what I was asking for. He did not coddle me or tell me to sleep on it. He recognized that I was making the very first executive decision of my new life. You want a voluntary termination of parental rights? Andre stated, nodding slowly, as the strategy formed in his head. You want him to sign away every single legal claim, right, and financial obligation to Leo. Can you make him sign it before he boards that plane, I asked? Andre opened his briefcase and pulled out his laptop, flipping it open on his lap. Bradley, us flight is at 9 tonight. It is currently 3:15 in the afternoon. He is currently panicked about securing his new life and protecting his stolen cash. I am going to draft a binding legal contract right now. In exchange for you signing a waiver releasing him from all future alimony and child support claims, and a non-disclosure agreement preventing us from reporting the transfer to the authorities or his new employer, he will sign a complete irrevocable termination of his parental rights. Will a judge actually uphold that? Rebecca asked nervously, wringing her hands. Usually courts do not let fathers just sign away their rights to avoid paying child support. They do when the mother agrees to assume total financial responsibility, and when we attach a sworn affidavit detailing his explicit refusal to care for a medically fragile infant. Andre replied, his fingers flying rapidly across his keyboard. Bradley is a coward. He wants a clean, quiet break with his mistress. When I explain that the alternative is an immediate court injunction freezing his passport and alerting Dubai immigration to his financial fraud, he will sign it faster than he can breathe. For the next 2 hours, my sterile hospital room transformed into a tactical war room. The rhythmic beeping of Leo-us monitor down the hall became my driving metronome. I signed the divorce petition modifications. I signed the comprehensive financial waivers. I legally absorbed hundreds of thousands of dollars in impending medical debt without a second thought. I was technically signing away my financial ruin, but I knew I was purchasing my son's absolute freedom from a man who despised his very existence. At 5:45 in the evening, Andre hit send on a highly encrypted email directed to Bradley U.S. phone. We waited in a suffocating, heavy silence. 10 minutes passed. Then 20. I pictured Bradley sitting comfortably in the first-class lounge at the airport, sipping an expensive cocktail with Vanessa abruptly opening the email from a top-tier corporate lawyer. I imagined the color violently draining from his face as he read Andrea's flawless ironclad legal threats. I imagined the terrifying realization dawning on him that his perfect escape route was completely surrounded by legal landmines. He thought he had outsmarted a vulnerable woman, but he had walked blindly into a trap set by a man who destroyed corporate executives for a living. The clock ticked closer to his boarding time, each passing second solidifying my newfound resolve. I was no longer a victim waiting for rescue. I was a mother securing her child's future. At exactly 6:12 in the evening, the sharp ping of an incoming email shattered the heavy silence in my hospital room. My breath hitched in my chest, but Andre did not flinch. He calmly placed his hand on his mousepad and clicked open the message. The sterile white glow of the laptop screen illuminated his face as his eyes scanned the attached documents. I watched his expression, searching for any sign of a counteroffer or a refusal. Instead, a deep, satisfied exhale escaped his lips. He signed it, Andre stated, his voice ringing with absolute finality. Every single page. Andre opened the files one by one, verifying the digital signatures and the timestamp. Bradley had executed the voluntary termination of parental rights, the non-disclosure agreement, and the financial waivers. He had surrendered all legal claims to my son to protect his stolen cash and his precious overseas visa. Attached to the legal documents was a short, bitter message typed directly into the email body. Deal, Bradley wrote. Keep the burden. Do not ever contact me again. Andre reached into his sleek leather briefcase and extracted a compact portable printer. He connected it to his laptop, and the soft hum of the machine processing the files felt like the sound of a closing vault. He printed the termination agreement, the ink still warm, as he handed the pages to me. He is legally a ghost, Lauren, Andre said, gently but firmly. He has no son. You have sole legal and physical custody forever. If he ever tries to step foot in this country and claim otherwise, this document destroys him. I held the warm paper in my trembling hands. A single tear escaped my eye and dropped onto the black ink smudging Bradley's signature. But it was not a tear of sorrow or heartbreak. It was a tear of pure, unadulterated victory. I was 25 years old, flat broke, bleeding from a major abdominal surgery, and staring down the barrel of astronomical medical debt. Yet I had just won the only war that mattered. I had purchased my child's absolute freedom from a man who viewed his existence as a liability. Rebecca sat on the edge of my bed and wrapped her arms around my shoulders. "You did it," she whispered fiercely. "You protected him. We are going to get through the rest of this together." I looked at the legal document one last time before handing it back to Andre for safekeeping. The victim who had cried over a $14 bank balance was gone. In her place, a new hardened version of myself was rapidly taking shape. I wiped my face and sat up a little straighter, ignoring the sharp pull of my surgical staples. There was no more room for panic. Panic was an emotion for people who had the luxury of falling apart. I had to build an empire from absolute scratch. The stark reality of my new life crashed into me the moment I was discharged from the hospital 3 days later. Walking out through the sliding glass doors with an empty car seat, while Leo remained behind in the neonatal intensive care unit, was a unique kind of torture. I did not return to the comfortable suburban apartment Bradley and I had shared. I could not afford the rent, and I refused to be surrounded by the ghosts of a dead marriage. Instead, I moved into a tiny, cramped studio apartment on the industrial outskirts of Boston. I could only secure the lease because Andre and Rebecca quietly covered the first and last month's rent. The apartment smelled faintly of old paint and bleach, and the heating radiator clanked loudly throughout the night. It was a severe downgrade from my previous life, but it was mine. It was the absolute bottom, which meant the only possible direction was up. I did not have the time or the energy to mourn my marriage. Grief is a luxury reserved for those who have a safety net. I had an infant fighting for every breath inside a hospital incubator, and a staggering $112,000 in medical debt bearing down on me. The billing department at the hospital had already started sending the initial invoices, thick envelopes that I stacked neatly on my small kitchen counter. I did not hide from them. I opened every single one. I memorized the numbers. They became my fuel. Every morning at 4:30, long before the sun rose over the Boston skyline, I boarded 2 different city buses to reach the medical center. I would scrub my hands until they were raw, put on a sterile yellow gown, and sit by Leo's plastic enclosure. I would slip my hands through the round portholes to touch his fragile, translucent skin. He was so small, surrounded by wires and tubes, but his chest rose and fell with a stubborn, fierce rhythm. He was a fighter. He had my blood in his veins. I whispered to him about the world outside. I told him about the tiny apartment. I told him about his Uncle Andre and Aunt Rebecca. Most importantly, I made him a promise. I swore to him that no matter what it took, no matter how many hours I had to work or how many obstacles I had to crush, I would build an impenetrable fortress around him. I promised him that he would never feel the sting of poverty, and he would never know the cruelty of the man who walked away. By 8 in the morning, I would leave the hospital and head straight to my desk at the regional medical supply distributor where I worked as a junior analyst. Before the divorce, I had been content with my entry-level salary and predictable hours. But junior analyst pay would not clear $100,000 in debt or build the fortress I had promised my son. I needed massive leverage. I needed to become entirely indispensable to the executives who ran the company. I stopped chatting with coworkers in the break room. I stopped taking lunch hours. I channeled every ounce of my anger, my fear, and my betrayal into raw, aggressive productivity. I began dissecting the logistics of moving sterile equipment, oxygen tanks, and surgical tools from warehouses to hospital loading docks. I looked at the spreadsheets not as mundane tasks, but as a puzzle I could exploit. I was ready to go to war with the corporate world, and I would not stop until I conquered it. When Leo was finally cleared to leave the neonatal intensive care unit after 3 agonizing months, the reality of my new existence hit with the force of a freight train. He came home attached to a portable oxygen concentrator, a heavy humming machine that became the permanent soundtrack of our lives. My tiny studio apartment was transformed into a makeshift triage center. Medical supply boxes were stacked floor to ceiling against the peeling wallpaper hiding the water stains. I had exactly one armchair, a second-hand crib, and a folding table where I set up my laptop. There was no nursery painted in pastel colors. There were no baby showers or congratulatory balloons. There was only the rhythmic whoosh and hiss of the oxygen machine and the terrifying responsibility of keeping a 3-pound human alive completely on my own. My days became a brutal, calculated marathon of pure survival. I slept in 90-minute intervals, jolting awake every time Leo coughed, or whenever the medical monitors beeped to signal a drop in his oxygen levels. By 5 in the morning, I was already logged into the corporate server, reviewing overnight supply manifests and cross-referencing hospital inventory shortages before my supervisors even had their first cup of coffee. I bathed Leo with military precision, administered his medications down to the exact milligram, and secured his breathing tubes. Then I carried him and his heavy oxygen equipment down 3 flights of stairs because the building elevator was chronically broken. I dropped him off at a specialized medical daycare facility across town, a place that consumed 70% of my monthly paycheck, before catching the commuter train to the corporate office. I worked 80-hour weeks without a single complaint. I did not take sick days. I did not take lunch breaks. While my colleagues gathered in the break room to gossip about office politics or complain about weekend traffic, I remained glued to my dual monitors. I was not there to make friends. I was there to find the structural weaknesses in the regional medical supply chain. The company I worked for distributed critical surgical equipment, oxygen tanks, and sterilized trauma kits to hospitals across New England. It was a multi-million-dollar operation, but underneath the polished corporate facade, it was bleeding money. The routing systems were archaic. Dispatchers were sending trucks on overlapping routes, wasting thousands of gallons of fuel. Warehouses were stockpiling expensive perishable medical supplies in the wrong districts, leading to massive expiration write-offs, while hospitals just 30 miles away experienced critical shortages. The executives at the top were completely blind to the logistical hemorrhaging happening at the ground level. They saw spreadsheets full of acceptable losses. I saw an opportunity to make myself undeniably vital. Every night after picking Leo up from the medical daycare and enduring the grueling transit back to our cramped apartment, my real shift began. I would sit on the worn carpet at 2 in the morning, rocking my fragile son with my left arm, while my right hand flew across the laptop keyboard. I taught myself advanced data analytics and predictive modeling using free online resources. I mapped out the entire Eastern Seaboard hospital network on a cheap whiteboard I bought from a discount store. I tracked the seasonal admission rates, the emergency room surges, and the precise inventory demands of every major trauma center in our district. I was coding a proprietary routing algorithm, a dynamic supply chain model designed to predict hospital shortages, before the head nurses even realized they needed to place an order. The physical toll was staggering. There were mornings I looked in the bathroom mirror and barely recognized the gaunt, hollow-eyed woman staring back at me. My clothes hung loosely on my frame because I frequently skipped dinners to afford the exorbitant co-pays for Leo U.S. specialized pulmonary appointments. My hands were perpetually shaking from an unhealthy mixture of extreme sleep deprivation and black coffee. But every time the exhaustion threatened to pull me under, I would look at the legal document Andre had printed in the hospital room. I kept Bradley U.S. signed termination of parental rights framed on my desk. It was not a trophy. It was a daily reminder of the abyss I was climbing out of. Every time my vision blurred from staring at lines of code, I remembered Bradley adjusting his silk tie and calling my son a burden. That memory was pure high-octane fuel. It burned away the fatigue and left only a cold, sharp ambition. For 8 months, I gathered my data in absolute silence. I did not pitch my ideas to my immediate supervisor, a lazy middle manager who would have undoubtedly stolen my work and presented it as his own to secure a bonus. I bypassed the entire middle management structure completely. I waited for the perfect, undeniable moment to strike. That moment arrived in the middle of a brutal winter storm that paralyzed the entire Boston metropolitan area. The heavy snowfall shut down major highways, grounded cargo flights, and threw the regional hospital supply chain into absolute chaos. The company dispatch center was in a state of blind panic. The largest pediatric hospital in the state was running dangerously low on specialized infant ventilators and emergency intubation kits. The standard delivery routes were blocked by 3 feet of snow, and the executives were scrambling, bracing for a public relations disaster and the horrific reality of lost lives. I stood up from my cubicle, grabbed my laptop, and walked directly into the glass-walled office of the chief executive officer. I did not knock. I did not ask for permission. I bypassed his protesting secretary and placed my laptop squarely on his mahogany desk. I did not apologize for the interruption. I looked the executive directly in the eyes and told him I had a rerouting protocol that utilized secondary municipal roads and a staggered warehouse transfer system that could get the ventilators to the pediatric ward in under 90 minutes. The chief executive officer stared at me, his face pale and tight with stress. He looked at my laptop screen, then back at my face, searching for a trace of hesitation. There was none. He picked up his desk phone, dialed the main dispatch floor, and ordered them to follow my exact routing instructions. I took over his keyboard. I directed the drivers, street by street, bypassing the buried interstates and utilizing snowplow routes I had cross-referenced with the City Department of Public Works. The delivery trucks navigated the blizzard with absolute precision. 84 minutes later, the pediatric ward director called the executive office in tears to confirm the ventilators had arrived safely. The hospital crisis was averted, and the company was hailed as a savior on the local evening news. The next morning, the chief executive officer called me back into his office. He slid a single piece of paper across the mahogany desk, offering me a promotion to senior analyst and a $10,000 bonus. I did not even look at the paper. I slid it right back to him. I opened my briefcase, pulled out a 300-page binder containing my 8 months of predictive modeling, and dropped it onto his desk with a heavy, deliberate thud. I told him the bonus was a profound insult. I pointed to the data showing how my algorithm could cut his operational bleeding by 18% in the first quarter alone, saving the company upwards of $12 million annually. I demanded the title of Vice President of Logistics and a base salary that matched the raw value I was bringing to the table. He balked at first, citing my young age and lack of executive experience. I simply picked up my binder and told him I would take my algorithm directly to his biggest competitor by noon. He caved immediately. I walked out of that office as vice president. For the next 2 years, I overhauled their entire distribution network. I fired incompetent regional managers, renegotiated massive fleet contracts, and implemented my dynamic supply chain model. I delivered a 22% reduction in operational costs within 18 months. The board of directors praised the chief executive officer for his visionary leadership, rewarding him with massive stock options and luxury corporate retreats. I sat in quiet board meetings, watching mediocre men pat themselves on the back for the grueling, sleepless work I had executed from the floor of my cramped studio apartment. That was the exact moment my ambition permanently evolved. I refused to spend the rest of my life building lucrative empires for men who did not know how to lay a single brick. I was going to build my own. I called Andre on a Friday evening and told him my plan. We met at his high-rise office downtown, and I laid out the architecture for my own independent firm. I needed to legally structure a corporation draft, airtight non-compete workarounds, and secure a massive commercial business loan. Andre was ruthless in his execution. He shielded my intellectual property and set up the corporate framework for what would quickly become Apex Medical Logistics. Securing the initial loan was the ultimate test of my resolve. I sat across from 3 commercial banking executives, presenting my flawless track record of saving millions in hospital distribution logistics. They saw my numbers, my highly aggressive growth projections, and the sheer unyielding confidence in my execution. The bank approved a multi-million-dollar line of credit without asking for a second meeting. The early days of Apex Medical Logistics were brutal and entirely unforgiving. I leased a warehouse space on the industrial outskirts of the city that smelled heavily of damp cardboard and industrial cleaner. I aggressively poached two of the best dispatchers from my former employer. When my delivery drivers called out sick, I personally drove the heavy cargo trucks through sleet and freezing rain to ensure a specialized surgical mesh delivery made it to an operating room on time. I operated on a zero margin for error because the medical industry simply does not tolerate failure. My first major independent breakthrough came exactly 7 months after launching Apex. The largest trauma center in Massachusetts was deeply dissatisfied with their current vendor, suffering from chronic dangerous shortages of critical care kits. I secured a 10-minute pitch with their chief procurement officer. I did not give a standard boring sales presentation. I brought an interactive tablet displaying a localized predictive model that tracked their historical emergency room data. I proved that Apex could actively anticipate their trauma kit shortages based on holiday weekend trends and seasonal highway accident rates. I guaranteed a zero-fail delivery protocol, backing it up with strict financial penalties if we ever missed a delivery window. I walked out of that hospital with an exclusive 5-year vendor contract worth $8 million. That contract was the absolute catalyst. Once the largest medical center validated my logistics model, the corporate dominoes began to fall. Regional hospitals, private specialized clinics, and wealthy outpatient surgical centers rushed to sign exclusive contracts with Apex. I targeted the exact supply chain routes my former employer had foolishly neglected. While they were busy appeasing shareholders with quarterly dividends, I was reinvesting every single dollar of profit back into Apex Logistics infrastructure. I purchased climate-controlled storage facilities located strategically within 15 miles of major metropolitan hospital hubs. This proximity allowed Apex to guarantee emergency delivery windows that no other national distributor could possibly match. When a specialized cardiac unit in Rhode Island needed emergency surgical valves at 3 in the morning, my team delivered them in 24 minutes. We became known not just as a vendor, but as a critical extension of the emergency response system. As the company exploded in financial value, my personal reality shifted dramatically. The tiny studio apartment became a distant, fading memory. I bought a sprawling, highly secure home in a pristine neighborhood. More importantly, the suffocating medical debt was eradicated completely. Leo was no longer reliant on the charity of underfunded hospital programs. I hired the absolute best private pediatric specialists in the country. We transitioned him off the heavy oxygen equipment. He grew stronger, faster, and brighter every single day. The fragile infant who had fought for breath in an incubator was transforming into a vibrant, brilliant child. I had kept the promise I made to him in that dark hospital room. I had built an impenetrable fortress, and I financed it entirely with the blood, sweat, and undeniable brilliance of my own hard work. Fast forward to the present day. I am 34 years old, and the frantic, desperate survival mode of my 20s has been entirely replaced by a calculated, cold precision. I am sitting behind a custom-made walnut desk in my corner office, looking out through floor-to-ceiling glass windows at the freezing gray expanse of the Boston Harbor. I am wearing a tailored charcoal suit reviewing the quarterly earnings reports for Apex Medical Logistics. The numbers on the screen do not induce panic anymore. They represent absolute dominance. My company is currently valued at $68 million. We have expanded far beyond the Massachusetts borders. Apex operates a massive fleet of temperature-controlled distribution vehicles across 12 different states, managing the critical supply chains for 42 major hospital networks. I employ hundreds of dispatchers, warehouse technicians, and route analysts. I dictate the market terms. Yet despite sitting on top of a multi-million-dollar logistics empire, I do not live a flashy, ostentatious lifestyle. I do not drive a bright red European sports car, and I refuse to flaunt designer handbags on social media. I still drive a highly reliable, heavily armored domestic SUV. My home is a beautiful but discreet property, secured behind heavy iron gates and state-of-the-art surveillance systems, in a quiet, heavily wooded suburb. I live with this extreme level of discretion because my memory is flawlessly sharp. I vividly remember staring at a bank balance of $14.12 while my surgical incision bled through my hospital gown. I remember the absolute terror of sudden crushing financial ruin. Because of that profound trauma, I made a strategic, aggressive decision early on to protect my assets from any unforeseen liabilities, predatory lawsuits, or ghosts from my past. 2 years ago, I brought my brother-in-law Andre into my corner office. I slid a massive, heavily indexed portfolio across my walnut desk, containing the complete financial architecture of my entire life. Every corporate share of Apex Medical Logistics, every piece of commercial real estate I had acquired, the offshore investment portfolios, and the aggressive venture capital stakes I had purchased. I want everything locked down, I told Andre, looking at him with absolute seriousness. I want a financial fortress so deep and so legally complex that no creditor, no lawsuit, and no individual could ever pierce the corporate veil. Andre smiled, leaning back in the leather guest chair, his brilliant legal mind already assembling the necessary corporate architecture. As a top-tier corporate lawyer, he specialized in asset protection for ultra-high net worth individuals. He understood exactly what I was asking for. "We are going to build a ghost entity," Andre explained, tapping his gold pen against the desk. "An impenetrable corporate shell that legally absorbs your wealth, effectively making you a high-earning employee on paper while shielding the actual millions from any personal liability." Within 3 weeks, Andre established a completely insulated, irrevocable blind trust. We officially named the corporate entity L&A Holdings. On paper and in the public eye, L&A Holdings was an aggressive, faceless corporate entity registered in Delaware to take advantage of their strict corporate privacy laws. It quietly bought up commercial debt, managed prime medical real estate, invested heavily in secure municipal bonds, and held the vast majority of voting shares in several logistics firms, including Apex. It filed massive corporate tax returns and operated through a sophisticated network of shell companies and legal proxies. It was a financial titan operating entirely in the shadows. In reality, L&A simply stood for Leo and Andre. Andre was appointed as the sole legal executor and trustee of the holding company. He maintained absolute fiduciary control over the trust U.S. aggressive investment strategies, and the sole exclusive beneficiary of every single asset, every piece of real estate, every collected commercial debt package, and every penny of that $68 million empire. My 9-year-old son, Leo. Legally speaking, I own nothing but a modest, highly taxed salary as the chief executive officer of Apex Medical Logistics. I did not own the commercial warehouses. I did not own the distribution fleet. L&A Holdings owned them. If anyone ever tried to sue me personally, or if some distant phantom from my past ever tried to claim a percentage of my net worth, they would hit a solid brick wall. They would find a hard-working corporate executive with a nice salary, but the millions belonged entirely to a ghost entity. Leo was completely shielded both financially and physically. The fragile 3-pound premature infant who had desperately fought for breath inside a plastic hospital incubator was now a thriving, energetic, and brilliant 9-year-old boy. He had successfully transitioned off all pulmonary support equipment years ago. He was a mathematics prodigy, completely obsessed with complex geometry, architectural blueprints, and computer coding. He attended an exclusive private school and spent his weekends building intricate motorized robotic models on the floor of our living room, completely unaware of the massive corporate holding company operating exclusively in his name. Leo had my dark eyes and my stubborn determination, but he possessed absolutely none of Bradley's arrogant, dismissive cruelty. He was an incredibly kind, empathetic child who insisted on rescuing stray animals and frequently asked to donate his allowance to the local Children's Hospital. Rebecca and Andre were a constant loving presence in his life, filling the home with laughter, stability, and the fierce protection of a true chosen family. My life was a perfectly calibrated, flawlessly maintained machine. I had won the war. I possessed absolute peace, unshakable wealth, and a brilliant son I adored more than life itself. The severe trauma of my 20s, the betrayal in the hospital room, and the suffocating medical debt were all permanently buried in the ashes of a completely different lifetime. The man who had caused that pain was nothing but a faded, legally severed memory. I was secure. I was untouchable. Until my desk phone vibrated sharply against the wood on a rainy Tuesday morning, threatening to shatter the fortress I had spent 9 grueling years building. I reached across the walnut desk and pressed the blinking intercom button. "Yes, Samantha," I said, keeping my voice perfectly level. Ms. Lauren, my executive assistant, said, her voice laced with an unusual tone of panic and confusion. "There is a man in the main lobby demanding to see you. He does not have an appointment. He is making quite a scene with the front desk security. He says he is your husband." The silver pen in my hand stopped moving. The ambient noise of the harbor wind against the glass suddenly felt deafening. A cold, forgotten phantom had just stepped directly out of an unmarked grave. "Send building security," I instructed flatly. "I do not have a husband." "I am trying, ma'am," Samantha whispered urgently. "But he is yelling that he has a legal right to see his son. He is threatening to call the local press if you do not come down. He keeps shouting your maiden name." A dark, dangerous anger flared in my chest, replacing the initial shock with pure, calculated ice. Bradley had returned. He was standing in the lobby of my $68 million logistics empire, attempting to use the son he had discarded as leverage for a public spectacle. He wanted a scene. I would not give him one. "Tell security to escort him to conference room B on the 4th floor," I commanded. "Do not let him near the executive suites. Confiscate his phone at the door. I will be down in exactly 5 minutes." I released the intercom button and stood up. I did not rush. I took a moment to smooth the lapels of my tailored charcoal suit. I checked my reflection in the dark glass of the window. There was no trace of the bleeding, terrified 25-year-old girl he had left in that hospital room. I was a corporate titan. I owned the building he was currently standing in. I walked out of my office projecting absolute authority with every step I took down the carpeted hallway. When I opened the heavy glass door of conference room B, 2 broad-shouldered security guards were standing silently against the back wall. Sitting at the long mahogany table was a man I barely recognized. The arrogant, polished executive who had tossed divorce papers onto my hospital bed was entirely gone. The 34-year-old Bradley sitting in front of me looked like a hollowed-out shell of a human being. The expensive, tailored navy suit had been replaced by a cheap, ill-fitting gray jacket that frayed at the cuffs. The gleaming luxury watch was missing from his wrist. His face was deeply lined, his skin carried an unhealthy grayish pallor, and his posture screamed of profound defeat. Lauren Bradley gasped, jumping out of his chair the moment I entered. His eyes darted around the luxurious conference room, taking in the expensive digital displays and the sleek, modern architecture. "My God, look at you. Look at this place. You own this company." "Sit down, Bradley," I ordered. My voice was a whip cracking through the air. He flinched heavily, dropping back into the leather chair. The security guards shifted their weight, ready to intervene at the slightest provocation. I did not sit. I stood at the head of the conference table, looking down at him with the clinical detachment of a scientist observing a dying insect. "You have exactly 3 minutes to explain why you are trespassing in my building before I have you arrested for harassment," I stated. "I need help, Lauren," he pleaded, his hands trembling slightly as he placed them on the table. "Everything is gone. Everything was taken from me." He did not wait for my permission to continue. The pathetic, miserable story poured out of him in a desperate, rushing waterfall of excuses. The glamorous new life in Dubai had been nothing but a spectacular, disastrous illusion. Vanessa, the mistress, he had drained my bank account to impress, had methodically bled him dry. Over the course of 9 years, she had convinced him to funnel his massive consulting salaries into high-risk overseas real estate ventures registered exclusively in her name. When the overseas markets shifted, Vanessa completely vanished. She liquidated every single asset, emptied his offshore accounts, and fled to Europe, with a younger investor, leaving Bradley holding the bag for astronomical corporate debts. The United Arab Emirates does not treat financial debt lightly. There is no bankruptcy protection for expatriates. When Bradley could not pay his creditors, he was immediately fired from his consulting firm, detained by local authorities, and stripped of his visa. "They deported me," Lauren Bradley whispered, his voice cracking with self-pity. "They seized my apartment, my car, everything. I was put on a plane back to the United States with nothing but the clothes on my back. And it gets worse. Because I had not filed American taxes properly while living abroad, the Internal Revenue Service was waiting for me. I owe the federal government over $250,000 in back taxes and penalties. I am completely bankrupt. I am sleeping on a friend U.S. couch." I listened to this incredible tale of absolute financial ruin, my facial expression remaining completely impassive. He was expecting shock. He was expecting the soft, compliant woman who used to eagerly manage his schedule and praise his accomplishments. He was searching my eyes for a single drop of mercy. He found nothing but a blank, impenetrable wall. "Your 3 minutes are almost up," I noted, checking the clock on the wall. "I still have not heard a single valid reason why you are sitting in my conference room." Bradley blinked, clearly taken aback by my freezing reception. "Lauren, please. I am destitute. I have absolutely nothing left. But then I saw your name in a regional business magazine. I saw that you built this massive medical logistics company. You are a multimillionaire now. You have more money than you could ever spend." The realization hit me instantly. He had not come here to apologize for abandoning his premature son. He had not come here to seek redemption. He had searched my name, seen my corporate net worth, and tracked me down looking for a desperate bailout. The audacity was so staggering it was almost impressive. "And you thought what?" I asked, softly stepping closer to the table. "You thought you could simply walk into my corporate headquarters and I would write a check to the man who stole $48,000 from me while I was bleeding on a hospital bed." He shrank back in his chair, but the desperate greed in his eyes quickly morphed into something much darker and far more calculating. His posture shifted, the pathetic victim routine instantly vanishing as his survival instincts kicked in. "I know I made a mistake," Bradley said, lowering his voice into a threatening, smooth cadence. "A terrible mistake. I went to Dubai to find myself, to figure out who I was. But I am back now. I am an American citizen, and more importantly, I am a father. I have a son, a 9-year-old boy who needs his biological dad in his life." The trap was officially sprung. He was broke, he was cornered, and he was staring at a woman he believed was an easy target sitting on a mountain of cash. He had no idea what was actually waiting for him. Section 8. 1,000 words. Bradley leaned forward, attempting to manufacture a look of deep paternal longing. The sudden transition from desperate beggar to righteous, remorseful father was so jarringly rehearsed that it bordered on comedic. He placed his hands flat on the mahogany table, taking a deep breath to project an aura of newfound stability and maturity. "You have to understand where my head was at back then." Bradley continued, his voice adopting a practiced, gentle cadence. "I was 26 years old. I was terrified. We were facing a mountain of debt, and seeing Leo in those machines, it completely broke me. I suffered a massive psychological break, Lauren. I panicked. What I did was inexcusable, but it was born out of fear, not malice. I never stopped loving him, not for a single day. I stood perfectly still at the head of the table. I did not cross my arms. I did not shift my weight. I let his words hang in the sterile, climate-controlled air of the conference room. I let the silence stretch until it became suffocating, forcing him to squirm under my unblinking gaze. "You went to Dubai to find yourself." I repeated his earlier words, stripping them of all emotional inflection. "You found yourself in the arms of your mistress, spending $48,000 that was meant to keep your premature son breathing. You did not suffer a psychological break, Bradley. You made a calculated financial decision to abandon a medically fragile infant because you preferred luxury over responsibility. Bradley flinched, but he quickly recovered, doubling down on the manipulation. You are holding on to anger, Lauren, and I do not blame you for that. But you are letting your bitterness blind you to what is best for Leo. A boy needs his father. He needs male guidance. I have spent the last 9 years carrying this immense guilt, waking up every morning wondering what my son looks like, wondering if he likes sports or science. You cannot punish an innocent child just because you are still mad at me for leaving. It was a classic textbook gaslighting attempt. He was actively trying to rewrite history, painting himself as a tragic, flawed hero who was unjustly separated from his child by a vindictive, bitter ex-wife. He wanted me to feel guilty. He wanted me to believe that by protecting my son, I was actually harming him. He was hoping the wealthy, successful woman standing in front of him still harbored the insecurities of a deserted young mother. Are you quite finished? I asked. He paused, clearly thrown off by my absolute lack of emotional reaction. Lauren, I am pouring my heart out to you. I am humbling myself. I am asking for forgiveness and a chance to be a real family again. We were never a family, I stated, my voice echoing sharply off the glass walls. And you are not humbling yourself. You are performing a severely under-rehearsed monologue because you are broke, facing federal tax evasion charges, and looking for a lucrative meal ticket. You did not wake up every morning wondering about Leo. You woke up in penthouses in the United Arab Emirates, spending stolen money until the woman you left us for bled you dry and discarded you. Bradley stood up abruptly, his chair scraping loudly against the hardwood floor. He slammed his hand against the table, dropping the gentle father routine entirely. Do not speak to me like I am one of your employees. I am Leo, us father. I have rights. You kept him from me. You hoarded him while you built this massive corporation, probably using the sympathy card of being a single mother to get ahead. You shut me out. I did not shut you out, I replied, my voice dropping to a dangerous, icy whisper. You walked out. You stood at the foot of my hospital bed while I was bleeding from surgery and called your son a burden. You explicitly stated you did not sign up for a life of suffocating diapers. You packed a briefcase and caught a first-class flight to a tax haven. I was young, he shouted, his face turning an angry, mottled red. People make mistakes. You cannot hold that over my head forever. Courts recognize rehabilitation. Judges believe in second chances for fathers who want to be involved. You are not a father, I said, stepping closer to him, closing the physical distance until he was forced to look directly into my eyes. A father sits in a plastic chair at 4 a.m, listening to an oxygen concentrator keep his child alive. A father works 80-hour weeks, skips meals, and builds a supply chain algorithm from scratch on a dirty studio apartment floor to pay for pediatric cardiologists. You are merely a sperm donor who fled the scene of the crime. You have contributed absolutely nothing to his existence, his survival, or his current happiness. Bradley swallowed hard, the prominent vein in his neck pulsing erratically. He was starting to realize that the scared, weeping 25-year-old girl he remembered was entirely dead. I was a titanium wall, and he was shattering his own fist trying to punch through it. You cannot keep him from me, Bradley said, his breathing growing shallow and rapid. I know my rights. I will march right into family court. I will tell the judge that I was suffering from undiagnosed trauma and that you weaponized my departure to alienate my son from me. I will demand joint custody. I will demand visitation. You cannot hide him in whatever mansion you bought with this company U.S. profits. I looked at him with an expression of profound boredom. He was deploying his final desperate tactic. He was trying to invoke the terror of a custody battle, hoping to trigger the protective, panicking mother instinct. He wanted me to break down, to beg him to stay away, to offer him a financial settlement, just to disappear. You are not going to see Leo, I said, articulating each word with surgical precision. You are not going to call him, you are not going to write to him, and you are certainly not going to drag him into a courtroom to play out your pathetic redemption fantasy. Your presence in this building is a security breach, and your presence in this city is an environmental hazard. I turned my back on him and walked toward the conference room door. Your 3 minutes expired a long time ago, Bradley. Security will escort you to the sidewalk. If you attempt to re-enter this facility, you will be arrested for trespassing. I placed my hand on the heavy glass handle, ready to end the interaction completely. But Bradley was a desperate, drowning man, and desperate men do not simply walk away from a potential life raft. He realized the emotional manipulation had failed spectacularly. He realized the guilt trip was completely useless against a woman who had forged her soul in the fires of medical debt and corporate warfare. He had to pivot to the only leverage he believed he had left. He had to pivot to outright extortion. "Wait!" Bradley barked. The sharp sound of his voice echoed off the thick glass walls. I kept my hand on the heavy stainless steel door handle, pausing without turning around. "You are a very smart woman, Lauren," he continued, the desperate edge in his voice replaced by a sudden greasy confidence. "You built a $68 million company. You know how to calculate risk. You know how to weigh a localized loss against a catastrophic systemic failure." I slowly turned to face him. He had straightened his posture, adjusting the lapels of his cheap gray jacket, as if he were preparing to negotiate a major corporate merger. The absolute audacity of the man was breathtaking. "I am listening," I said flatly. "I have been doing some reading," Bradley said, pacing slowly across the length of the conference room. "Massachusetts family courts are incredibly progressive these days. They strongly favor the active involvement of both biological parents in a child's U.S. life. Joint legal custody is practically the default presumption, regardless of the parent's personal history. And when there is a massive glaring disparity in income between the two parents, the courts are very quick to order child support and alimony to ensure the child experiences an equal standard of living in both households." He stopped at the opposite end of the mahogany table, placing his hands on the polished wood and leaning forward. The greedy hunger in his eyes was naked and repulsive. "I did the math, Lauren. Based on your corporate valuation and your probable executive salary, a judge would look at my current unemployed destitute status and award me an absolute fortune, reverse child support, spousal maintenance. It would be a massive financial bleeding for you. Get to the point," I demanded. "The point is, a messy public court battle is going to cost you millions in legal fees and corporate public relations damage," Bradley smirked. "The media loves a story about a ruthless millionaire female executive using her endless resources to crush a destitute, remorseful father trying to reunite with his only son. Your hospital clients might not appreciate the negative press. Your board of directors might find the scandal extremely distracting." He walked closer, his confidence swelling with every word. He honestly believed he had cornered me. "But I am a reasonable man. I do not want to destroy your company, and I do not necessarily want to disrupt Leo's life if I do not have to. I am willing to settle this entirely out of court. A private, quiet arrangement." "Define your arrangement," I said, my voice dangerously soft. "It's dangerously." $30,000 a month, Bradley stated, lifting his chin. "Tax-free. Directly deposited into an account I control. In exchange for that monthly stipend, I will quietly stay out of your way. I will not file for joint custody. I will not go to the press. I will let you and Leo continue your perfect, wealthy life without any interruptions from me. You can easily afford 30 grand a month, Lauren. It is a minor business expense to ensure your absolute peace of mind." I stared at him, letting his extortion demand hang in the air. He was attempting to blackmail me using the premature son he had discarded like trash 9 years ago. "And if I refuse your generous offer to extort me?" I asked. Bradley sighed, feigning deep regret. "Then I will be forced to assert my biological rights immediately. I know Leo attends that elite prep school over in Cambridge. I know exactly what time they let out for the afternoon. It would be a real shame if his biological father had to show up at the school gates to introduce himself in front of all his classmates and teachers. Imagine the psychological trauma that would cause a 9-year-old boy. Imagine the spectacle of the police having to intervene because a wealthy mother is trying to gatekeep a father from his own flesh and blood." My blood turned to absolute ice. The threat was explicit. He was promising to terrorize my child at his school, to shatter Leo's safe, structured world, just to force my hand financially. Bradley was actively weaponizing a 9-year-old boy's emotional stability to secure a monthly paycheck. You would traumatize your own son for a paycheck, I stated, making sure his exact intent was voiced aloud and confirmed. I am simply exercising my legal rights, Bradley countered smoothly. You have until Friday to wire the first $30,000 into my account. I will email you the routing numbers. If the money is not there by noon, I am driving straight to Cambridge. I will walk right onto that campus, and I will introduce myself to Leo. Then I will march directly to the family courthouse and file for full joint custody. The choice is entirely yours, Lauren. I did not scream. I did not lunge across the table and wrap my hands around his throat, no matter how intensely every maternal instinct in my body demanded immediate violence. I remained a portrait of absolute chilling composure. He thought he had outmaneuvered me. He thought the threat of public scandal and schoolyard ambushes would force me to open my corporate checkbook. He had no idea that he had just handed me the exact rope I needed to publicly hang him. You have made your position very clear, Bradley, I said, my voice completely devoid of panic or submission. You have presented a very specific, very detailed demand. I am glad you see reason. He smiled, relaxing his shoulders. I knew the smart, analytical girl I married was still in there somewhere. We can make this a seamless, highly beneficial transaction for both of us. I am going to leave this room now, I said, turning back to the heavy glass door. My security team will escort you to the street. Do not speak to my employees. Do not linger in the lobby. Friday at noon. Lauren Bradley called out to my back, his voice dripping with arrogant triumph. Do not make me go to that school. I pulled the door open and stepped out into the hallway, where my 2 security guards were waiting with strict military discipline. I did not look back at the pathetic, greedy man sitting in my conference room. I simply nodded to the guards. Remove him, I ordered. If he resists, use force. I walked toward the executive elevators, my mind already calculating the precise counteroffensive. Bradley thought he had initiated a profitable business negotiation. In reality, he had just triggered a total devastating war, and I was going to obliterate him entirely. The doors of the executive elevator slid shut, sealing me in a silent, descending steel box. I did not waste a single second processing the emotional shock of seeing my ex-husband. I pulled my phone from my blazer pocket and dialed Andre. He answered on the first ring, his sharp legal mind instantly detecting the urgency in my silence. I told him everything. I relayed Bradley a sudden appearance, the deportation from Dubai, the massive federal tax debt, and the explicit threat to ambush Leo at his private school unless I paid $30,000 a month in extortion money. Andre did not gasp or offer useless sympathy. I could hear the rapid clicking of his keyboard through the speaker as he immediately began pulling security protocols and drafting emergency court filings. We both knew Bradley was desperate, and desperate men are incredibly dangerous when they realize their demands are being ignored. Friday at noon arrived exactly as scheduled. I sat at my walnut desk watching the digital clock on my monitor tick past the deadline. I had not wired a single cent to the account routing number Bradley had emailed me. I had not replied to his messages. I simply let the deadline expire in absolute silence. Bradley quickly realized I had called his bluff. But instead of marching directly to the school campus that afternoon, he realized he needed leverage. He needed a weapon that could penetrate my corporate armor. He needed the court of public opinion. By Monday morning, Bradley had secured legal representation. He did not hire a prestigious corporate litigator. He hired Silas Montgomery, a sleazy bottom-feeding attorney famous for aggressive late-night television commercials and giant billboard advertisements promising massive settlements. Silas was a man who thrived on creating public spectacles to force wealthy opponents into quiet, lucrative settlements. He took Bradley's U.S. case on contingency, salivating at the prospect of extracting millions from the chief executive officer of a $68 million logistics empire. Silas knew their actual legal foundation was incredibly fragile, so he immediately deployed a different strategy. They launched a highly coordinated, vicious social media smear campaign. The first video dropped on a major local news blog and rapidly spread across social media platforms. It featured Bradley sitting on a worn, sagging couch in a dimly lit apartment, looking directly into the camera, with perfectly manufactured tear-filled eyes. He did not look like the arrogant executive who had tossed divorce papers onto a hospital bed. Silas had dressed him to look like a broken, remorseful, blue-collar everyman who just wanted to see his little boy. Bradley spun a masterful, entirely fabricated narrative. He told the camera that he had gone overseas 9 years ago to secure a better financial future for his medically fragile son. He claimed his overseas employers had trapped him in a predatory contract, seizing his passport and preventing him from returning home. He painted a picture of a man who had suffered in exile, working tirelessly to get back to American soil, only to return and find his ex-wife transformed into a bitter, power-hungry millionaire. He claimed I was using my vast corporate wealth to illegally gatekeep him from his own flesh and blood, simply because he was currently experiencing financial hardship. The algorithm rewarded the scandal instantly. The video went viral within 48 hours, fueled by targeted advertisements Silas had purchased to ensure maximum local visibility. The headlines were sensationalized and brutal. Millionaire healthcare executive denies broke father access to son. Heartless CEO uses wealth to erase boy us dad. The comments sections across every platform filled with absolute venom directed squarely at me. Strangers who knew absolutely nothing about the $48,000 he had stolen or the neonatal intensive care unit bills I had paid by scrubbing warehouse floors suddenly felt entitled to judge my character. They called me a monster. They called me a cold corporate tyrant who was psychologically damaging a child out of pure spite. The fallout rippled directly into my professional life. My corporate public relations director burst into my office, her face pale, holding a tablet displaying the latest wave of online vitriol. 2 board members called me within the hour, expressing deep concern about the negative press. Apex Medical Logistics relied on maintaining sterling ethical relationships with major hospital networks. Hospital administrators do not like loud, messy tabloid drama surrounding their critical supply chain vendors. The public relations team begged me to release a statement, to draft a press release defending my character, or to arrange a sympathetic television interview to counter Bradley U.S. narrative. I refused entirely. I sat at my desk and issued a strict company-wide gag order. I would not engage in a public mudslinging contest with a man who had abandoned his child. I would not turn Leo Us' private peaceful life into a highly publicized media circus just to defend my ego against internet trolls. I knew exactly what Silas and Bradley were trying to do. They were trying to panic me into a quick settlement to make the bad press disappear. They mistook my tactical, disciplined silence for fear. Andre stood by my side in my office, monitoring the escalating online situation. "Let them talk," Andre advised, adjusting his suit jacket with a calm, predatory grace. "Silas is playing a dangerous game. He is building a public narrative based on the assumption that Bradley actually retains legal parental rights. They are getting arrogant. They think your silence means you are scrambling for a defense. We need them arrogant, Lauren. We need them to feel so overly confident that they make a massive documented legal error." That fatal error was currently being planned in Silas Montgomery U.S. Chief Office. Furious that the viral videos had not resulted in a panicked phone call and a massive settlement check from my legal team, Silas advised his client to escalate the situation physically. The digital smear campaign had laid the necessary groundwork. Now they needed a physical confrontation. They needed footage of the wealthy, heartless mother actively ripping a child away from his weeping, desperate father. Silas told Bradley it was time to force the issue in the real world. They decided to bypass the corporate headquarters and go directly for the most vulnerable, highly emotional target available. They were going to ambush my 9-year-old son. Bradley mapped out the route to Leo U.S. exclusive private school, completely unaware that his impending performance was about to collide with a catastrophic legal reality. Wednesday afternoon at Cambridge Academy was a masterclass in disciplined routine. The exclusive private school, situated behind wrought iron gates and towering oak trees, operated with absolute security. Parents did not simply wander onto the grounds. Access required electronic clearance, registered license plates, and a matching photo identification. Bradley, driven by the reckless advice of his sleazy attorney, parked his rented sedan 3 blocks away. He and Silas walked toward the campus, accompanied by a freelance videographer holding a stabilized smartphone. The plan was incredibly simple. They would wait just outside the primary pedestrian gate, where the older students exited for the private car line. Bradley would spot his son rush forward in a display of overwhelming paternal emotion and capture the tearful reunion on camera. When the school security inevitably intervened, Silas would ensure the narrative framed the school as an extension of my malicious, wealthy gatekeeping. At exactly 3:15, the heavy oak doors of the main academic building swung open. Students in crisp navy blazers and gray trousers flooded down the stone steps. Bradley stood near the brick perimeter wall, scanning the crowd. He held a generic store-bought baseball glove in his left hand, a pathetic prop designed purely for the camera. Then he saw him. Leo was walking slightly apart from the main group of students. He was not laughing or playing tag with the other boys. My 9-year-old son was holding a thick leather-bound sketchbook, his dark eyes intensely focused on a complex geometric blueprint he was currently drawing. He walked with a quiet, deliberate confidence, completely absorbed in calculating the structural load-bearing capacity of a motorized bridge model he planned to build that evening. He wore his blazer unbuttoned, and his backpack hung off one shoulder. He was the absolute center of my universe, and he was walking directly toward a man he had never met. Bradley stepped directly into the center of the pedestrian pathway, blocking the exit entirely. The videographer raised the smartphone, framing the shot carefully. Silas nodded eagerly from the sidelines. Leo Bradley called out, his voice cracking with a perfectly manufactured theatrical sob. Leo stopped walking. He did not drop his sketchbook. He did not gasp. He simply looked up from his architectural drawing, his dark eyes landing on the strange, desperate man blocking his path to the car line. Leo tilted his head slightly to the left, analyzing Bradley with the exact same clinical, chilling detachment I used in the boardroom. "It is me," Bradley said, taking a step forward and holding out the baseball glove. "It is your dad. I finally made it back to you, buddy." Leo blinked twice. He looked at the cheap leather baseball glove, then back up to Bradley's face. He did not register fear, and he certainly did not register joy. He registered mild analytical confusion. "I think you have made a logistical error," Leo stated clearly. His voice was precise, entirely devoid of the emotional panic Bradley was desperately trying to provoke. "I do not play baseball. The statistical probability of injury significantly outweighs the strategic value of the sport. Furthermore, you are not my father." Bradley froze, the manufactured tears instantly drying up. The camera was still rolling, capturing the bizarre, entirely unscripted interaction. "Leo, it is me," Bradley insisted, his voice losing its soft edge and taking on a tone of frantic urgency. "Your mother hid me from you. She kept me away because she was angry. But I am your biological father. My name is Bradley." Leo adjusted his grip on his sketchbook. He looked at Bradley as if the man were a malfunctioning line of code that needed to be debugged. "My mother does not hide variables," Leo replied, his tone remaining perfectly even. "She eliminates inefficiencies. And according to my legal guardianship records, which I reviewed when we established my educational trust fund last year, my biological father voluntarily terminated his parental rights exactly 106 months ago. Legally speaking, you do not exist in my family structure. You are a biological donor with zero legal standing. Now please step aside. You are blocking the designated pedestrian transit zone." The silence that fell over the sidewalk was absolute. The videographer slowly lowered the smartphone, glancing at Silas with a look of pure confusion. Bradley stood paralyzed, his mouth hanging slightly open. He had prepared himself for a tearful, emotional boy who longed for a paternal figure. He had prepared for a terrified child who would cling to him. He was completely, utterly unprepared to face a 9-year-old mathematics prodigy who weaponized legal facts with the exact same ruthless, icy precision as his mother. Bradley's shock rapidly morphed into intense, humiliated anger. He realized the camera was capturing his complete rejection by a child who viewed him as nothing more than a minor annoying obstacle. "You listen to me," Bradley hissed, dropping the gentle father routine entirely. He lunged forward, reaching out to grab Leo by the shoulder. "I am your father, and you are going to show me some respect right now." Leo did not flinch. He simply took one calculated step backward, maintaining a safe physical perimeter. Before Bradley's hand could even brush the fabric of Leo's navy blazer, a massive, imposing figure materialized from the crowd of waiting drivers. It was my head of personal security, a former military contractor who had been specifically assigned to monitor Leo U.S. school drop-offs since the social media smear campaign began. The guard clamped a heavy, unyielding hand around Bradley's wrist, stopping his forward momentum instantly. "Do not touch the boy." The guard warned, his voice a low, dangerous rumble that commanded immediate compliance. Bradley tried to yank his arm away, his face turning a mottled, furious red. "Let go of me. I have rights. I am his father. Silas, get this on camera. They are assaulting a parent." Silas stepped forward, pulling legal documents from his briefcase, ready to escalate the confrontation into a full-blown public spectacle. But the spectacle was already over. A sleek black luxury sedan pulled smoothly up to the curb, its tires rolling to a stop just inches from where Silas was standing. The tinted rear window rolled down silently. Andre leaned out of the vehicle, adjusting his designer sunglasses. He looked at Silas, then at Bradley, a cold, ruthless, predatory smile playing across his face. The trap had been perfectly executed, and the desperate, foolish prey had finally walked directly into the center of the crosshairs. Andre stepped out of the sleek black luxury sedan, buttoning his tailored suit jacket with the commanding elegance of a man who owned the entire city block. Behind him, two marked Cambridge police cruisers pulled up sharply to the curb, their lights flashing silently in the crisp afternoon air, casting red and blue reflections across the brick walls. Four uniformed officers stepped out of the vehicles, their hands resting cautiously on their duty belts, as they quickly assessed the tense situation unfolding on the sidewalk. Silas Montgomery puffed out his chest, waving his generic legal documents like a flimsy shield. He pointed a trembling finger at Andre. "You cannot interfere with a biological father attempting to make contact with his child," Silas yelled, ensuring the hired videographer was capturing his loud performance. "We are simply exercising his fundamental rights. This is a public sidewalk, and my client has every right to be here." Andre did not raise his voice. He walked calmly up the stone steps, his polished shoes clicking rhythmically against the pavement. He completely ignored Silas, walking straight past the flustered attorney to stand directly between Bradley and Leo. The massive security guard released Bradley's wrist and stepped back slightly, allowing Andre to take the absolute lead. "Silas Montgomery," Andre said, stating the name like a terminal medical diagnosis. "I reviewed your late-night television commercials yesterday. Unfortunately, cheap courtroom theatrics do not supersede state law. You are currently advising your client to violate a strict active judicial order." Andre reached into his breast pocket and produced a folded, officially stamped document. He handed it directly to the lead police officer, completely bypassing Silas. "Officer, my name is Andre Washington. I am the chief legal counsel for Lauren and her son Leo. You are holding an emergency restraining order signed by a Superior Court judge exactly 45 minutes ago." The officer unfolded the document, his eyes scanning the judicial signature. "The order explicitly prohibits Bradley from coming within 500 feet of Lauren Leo or this academic institution," Andre stated clearly, his voice carrying incredible authority. "He is currently standing exactly 12 feet from my nephew." Bradley's face drained of all color, his manufactured outrage instantly transforming into genuine panic. "A restraining order," Bradley stammered, taking a small step backward. "On what grounds? I have not done anything wrong. I just want to see my boy." "The grounds are documented harassment, severe financial extortion, and a direct written threat to ambush a minor at his educational facility," Andre replied, turning his dark, piercing gaze to Bradley. You sent an email demanding $30,000 a month, explicitly stating that if the extortion money was not paid immediately, you would arrive at this campus to cause severe psychological trauma. You put your blackmail demand in writing, Bradley. That is a federal felony. Silas suddenly looked violently ill. His blustering confidence evaporated in a single second. He grabbed Bradley's arm, his eyes wide with terror. You sent an extortion email, Silas hissed furiously. You did not tell me you put a financial threat in writing. He also failed to inform you that he voluntarily terminated his parental rights 9 years ago. Andre added, his voice slicing through the tense air like a scalpel. Which means you, Silas, are currently filming the organized harassment of an unrelated minor child. I strongly suggest you tell your videographer to turn that camera off right now before I file a civil suit against your law firm that will completely bankrupt you before dinner. Silas frantically waved his hands at the cameraman. The red recording light blinked off instantly. Silas took a large, desperate step away from Bradley, actively trying to distance himself from his own radioactive client. The lead police officer stepped forward, unbuttoning a pouch on his belt. Sir, I have a valid court-issued restraining order here. You are in direct violation. Turn around and put your hands behind your back. No, please, Bradley begged, holding his hands up in total surrender. I did not know she actually got an order. Silas told me public property was legally safe. Officers, hold on a moment, Andre said smoothly, raising a single authoritative hand. My sister-in-law does not want to press criminal charges today. She does not want her son this afternoon disrupted by a messy arrest. She simply wants the perimeter secured and the immediate threat removed. Andre looked at Bradley with absolute unfiltered contempt. You are going to walk away right now. You are going to get into your rented car and you are going to drive back to whatever couch you are currently sleeping on. You will not post on social media. If you violate this order again, I will let the police arrest you, and I will personally ensure the district attorney pursues the maximum sentence for extortion. Andre turned his back on Bradley, dismissing him entirely. He knelt down to eye level with Leo. The 9-year-old prodigy had not moved a muscle during the exchange. He was simply watching the legal mechanics unfold. Are you ready to go home? Leo, Andre asked, his voice softening into genuine familial warmth. Yes, Uncle Andre, Leo replied, sliding his sketchbook safely into his backpack. The structural integrity of this sidewalk is compromised anyway. There are far too many unnecessary variables. Andre chuckled softly and placed a protective hand on Leo's shoulder, guiding him toward the waiting luxury sedan. The security guard walked closely behind them, ensuring the perimeter remained completely secure until they were safely inside the armored vehicle. Silas grabbed his briefcase and practically sprinted down the street, abandoning his client completely. Bradley stood alone on the sidewalk, surrounded by 4 police officers waiting for him to move. He was utterly humiliated. The grand reunion he planned had turned into a crushing legal defeat. But desperate men are profoundly stupid. As the sedan pulled away from the curb, Bradley yelled out one final threat. I will demand a formal mediation. She cannot hide behind legal tricks forever. Inside the quiet comfort of the car, Andre pulled out his phone and dialed Lauren U.S. direct line. The asset is secure. Andre reported, looking at Leo buckled safely into the back seat. And the target took the bait exactly as you predicted. He is demanding a formal mediation. Excellent, Lauren U.S. Voice crackled through the car speakers, cold and completely devoid of mercy. Schedule it for Friday. Let him bring his demands. It is time to close the trap. The official notice of mediation was delivered by a private courier to Silas Montgomery U.S. cramped, poorly lit office the very next morning. The document was printed on heavy cream-colored stationery, bearing the embossed crest of Andre U.S. prestigious corporate law firm. It was a formal invitation to resolve the pending familial dispute through private binding arbitration. When Bradley arrived at the law office an hour later to review the document, he practically vibrated with arrogant, unrestrained triumph. He slammed his hand down on Silas' cluttered desk, knocking over a stack of unpaid utility bills. I told you she would crack. Bradley gloated, a massive, greedy smile stretching across his face. She is terrified. That whole stunt with the police and the security guards yesterday was just a desperate bluff. She knows that if we drag this out into a public courtroom, the media will tear her logistics company apart. She is begging for a quiet settlement to protect her corporate image. Silas, who had literally run away from the school campus the day before, was suddenly acting like a fearless legal gladiator again. The scent of a massive corporate payout had completely erased his cowardice. He leaned back in his squeaky leather chair and steepled his fingers, nodding in smug agreement. "You played it perfectly," Bradley Silas said, his eyes gleaming with the anticipation of a contingency fee. The viral videos did exactly what they were supposed to do. We applied maximum public pressure and she immediately folded. Offering private mediation this quickly is a massive concession. It is the ultimate white flag. She wants this to disappear before the weekend, which means we hold absolutely all the leverage in that room. They spent the next 4 hours locked in Silas' dingy office, meticulously crafting a list of exorbitant, absolutely delusional demands. Bradley paced the stained carpet, treating the mediation strategy like a multi-million-dollar corporate acquisition. He felt entirely vindicated. In his twisted reality, the 9 years he spent ignoring his premature son were completely irrelevant. He genuinely believed he was owed financial compensation for the stress he endured while being deported from Dubai. First, Bradley dictated, holding up a finger, the monthly stipend. "I initially asked for $30,000, but since she decided to play games with restraining orders and police officers, the price just went up. I want $40,000 a month in tax-free reverse child support. That is barely a fraction of her corporate salary." Silas furiously scribbled the number onto his yellow legal pad. "Done. What about housing? You cannot maintain a relationship with a high-net-worth child while sleeping on a friend U.S. couch. A judge would agree that you need suitable accommodations to facilitate joint custody." "I want a house," Bradley confirmed, his eyes lighting up with unchecked greed. "Nothing too ostentatious, but it needs to be in a premium zip code, $800,000 minimum. It must have a security system, a modern kitchen, and a dedicated bedroom for Leo. She will purchase the property outright and transfer the deed directly into my name to avoid any future leverage." "What about transportation?" Silas prompted, tapping his pen. "A new luxury sport utility vehicle," Bradley answered immediately. "Paid in full, and I want guaranteed access to Leo U.S. private school records, joint legal custody on paper, and the right to 3 weekends a month. I probably will not even use the weekends, but I need the legal custody designation to guarantee the child support checks keep clearing." They continued building their extortion checklist, completely blinded by their own arrogance. They added demands for fully paid health insurance, a clause requiring Lauren to cover all of Silas' U.S. exorbitant legal fees, and a strict non-disparagement agreement preventing Lauren from ever speaking about Dubai. Bradley convinced himself that Lauren was a terrified, cornered woman desperate to protect her $68 million empire from bad press. He believed she would sign anything to make him disappear. Across the city, inside her corner office overlooking the freezing Boston Harbor, Lauren was experiencing none of the panic Bradley imagined. She sat at her custom walnut desk, sipping black coffee, her pulse steady and calm. Andre sat in the guest chair reviewing the final preparations for Friday. "He will ask for the moon," Andre stated, sliding a digital tablet across the desk. "Silas is a bottom feeder, but he knows how to inflate a settlement demand. They are going to walk into my conference room expecting you to hand over the keys to the kingdom. Let them ask." Lauren replied, her voice smooth and completely unbothered. "Let him list every single delusion he has constructed. I want him to feel as though he has completely cornered me. I want his arrogance to reach its absolute peak before we pull the floor out from under him." "Are the final documents secured?" Andre asked. "Everything is ready," Lauren confirmed, her dark eyes locking onto the gray water of the harbor. "The corporate acquisition was finalized this morning. The paperwork is flawless. There are 0 legal loopholes remaining. Human greed is an incredibly predictable variable." Bradley believed he was walking into a lucrative negotiation. He had spent the last week manipulating social media, harassing a 9-year-old boy, and attempting to terrorize a woman he fundamentally underestimated. He thought the mediation was the finish line of a victorious campaign. He had absolutely no idea it was an execution chamber. Lauren closed her laptop and stood up. The stage was set. The legal traps were fully armed. The financial snare was perfectly hidden beneath layers of complex corporate architecture. Friday would not be a negotiation. It would be an absolute slaughter. While Bradley spent his Thursday afternoon browsing luxury car catalogs and measuring imaginary drapes for a house he did not yet own, a silent, lethal financial transaction was executing in the background. The modern American financial system is a sprawling, interconnected web of liabilities, credit scores, and aggressively traded debt. When a person defaults on their financial obligations, those debts do not simply disappear into a void. They are packaged, bundled, and sold on the secondary market to private collection agencies for pennies on the dollar. Bradley had returned from Dubai, leaving a trail of absolute financial wreckage in his wake. His catastrophic downfall overseas was only half the story. When he was deported back to American soil, he attempted to maintain the illusion of his high-rolling expatriate lifestyle. He applied for high-interest credit cards. He took out predatory personal loans from secondary lenders, who did not properly verify his overseas employment status. He maxed out every single available line of credit to rent luxury cars and buy expensive dinners, desperately trying to project success, until the lenders finally caught on and cut him off completely. Furthermore, the federal government does not forgive tax evasion. The Internal Revenue Service had assessed massive penalties for the years Bradley lived in the United Arab Emirates, without properly filing his American tax returns. When federal tax debts remain unpaid for an extended period, the government occasionally outsources the collection of those specific distressed accounts to authorized private debt collection agencies. Between the defaulted credit cards, the predatory personal loans, and the massive federal tax liens Bradley was carrying, exactly $250,000 in toxic delinquent debt. He was a walking financial liability, but because he currently possessed absolutely zero assets, his creditors had written him off as uncollectible. They assumed he was a dead end. They were practically begging to offload his portfolio to anyone willing to buy the toxic paper. Andre knew this. As a top-tier corporate lawyer who specialized in hostile takeovers and asset protection, Andre understood the predatory mechanics of the secondary debt market better than anyone. He did not just build shields for Lauren, he knew how to forge weapons. On Wednesday morning, 48 hours before the scheduled mediation, Andre had initiated a highly confidential corporate maneuver. Operating through a fully licensed, heavily obfuscated subsidiary of L&A Holdings called Apex Recovery Solutions, Andre reached out directly to the commercial debt brokers holding Bradley U.S. delinquent accounts. The negotiation was brutally swift. Debt brokers typically sell uncollectible accounts in massive randomized bundles, making it difficult to purchase a specific individual U.S. debt. However, cash is the ultimate leverage in the corporate world. Andre did not haggle over pennies. He offered a premium upfront cash buyout to acquire the exclusive assigned rights to every single financial obligation Bradley currently owed. He purchased the defaulted credit card accounts. He purchased the predatory personal loans. He acquired the outsourced federal tax collection rights. The brokers were absolutely thrilled to liquidate a worthless portfolio. They transferred the titles, the original loan agreements, and the exclusive collection rights directly to Apex Recovery Solutions. The electronic wire transfer cleared the banking system in less than 2 hours. In the span of a single afternoon, Lauren and Andre effectively bought Bradley's entire financial existence. The legal power this transaction granted them was absolute and terrifying. By purchasing the debt, L&A Holdings became Bradley U.S. sole undisputed primary creditor. They did not just own pieces of paper, they owned the legal authority to financially destroy him at a moment U.S. notice. In the state of Massachusetts, a primary creditor holding $250,000 in validated delinquent debt possesses staggering legal remedies. They have the immediate right to petition the court for aggressive wage garnishments. They have the authority to execute instantaneous bank levies, meaning the second a single dollar enters any bank account bearing Bradley U.S. name, the creditor can legally seize it without warning. Most importantly, They hold the power to place an involuntary lien on any physical property the debtor attempts to acquire. This was the ultimate brilliant irony of Bradley U.S. extortion plot. Bradley was currently sitting in Silas U.S. cheap law office, arrogant and greedy, demanding that Lauren purchase an $800,000 house and transfer the deed directly into his name. He demanded a luxury vehicle paid in full. He demanded a $40,000 monthly cash stipend. He had absolutely no idea that the very second Lauren handed him a single asset, the very millisecond a house deed was registered in his name, or a dollar hit his checking account, Apex Recovery Solutions had the legal binding authority to seize it all. If Lauren gave him the house on Friday, Andre would legally foreclose on it by Monday morning to satisfy the outstanding $250,000 debt. Bradley was essentially demanding that Lauren feed him a massive feast, completely unaware that she now owned the stomach it would digest in. On Thursday evening, Andre walked into Lauren U.S. corner office, holding a sleek black leather binder. He placed it carefully on her custom walnut desk. The binder contained the fully executed debt transfer agreements, the original loan signatures, and the drafted legal motions for immediate asset seizure. "The acquisition is complete," Andre stated, his voice a low, satisfied rumble. L&A Holdings is now the exclusive owner of his entire financial portfolio. He owes us $250,000 payable immediately upon demand. Lauren opened the binder, her dark eyes scanning the official bank stamps and the transferred tax liens. A cold, predatory satisfaction settled deep in her chest. She traced her finger over Bradley's forged signatures on the defaulted loan applications. "He wants to play the role of a desperate father fighting a wealthy corporation," Lauren said softly, closing the heavy leather binder with a definitive snap. "Let him play his part. Tomorrow we are going to show him what corporate warfare actually looks like." The sun began to set over the Boston harbor, casting long, sharp shadows across the executive office. The trap was not just set. It was armed, locked, and completely inescapable. Friday morning dawned crisp and bitterly cold, mirroring the exact temperature of Lauren U.S. resolve. The stage was perfectly arranged for the ultimate execution. Bradley was walking into the mediation expecting a negotiation. He was walking into a financial slaughterhouse. The glass doors of Andre's downtown law firm slid open precisely at 10 o'clock. I sat at the far end of the expansive granite conference table, my hands neatly folded over a single unmarked manila folder. Andre stood near the floor-to-ceiling windows, projecting the casual, relaxed authority of a man entirely in control of his environment. He wore a midnight blue suit, his posture impeccably straight, radiating a silent, lethal confidence. Bradley and his sleazy attorney Silas Montgomery strutted into the room exactly 3 minutes late. It was a calculated power play, a pathetic attempt to establish dominance before a single word was spoken. Bradley wore a new, off-the-rack suit that still held the faint creases of its packaging. He swaggered toward the table with an unearned, arrogant grin, pulling out a chair and dropping heavily into it. Silas flanked him, dropping a thick, disorganized briefcase onto the polished granite with a loud, obnoxious thud. They looked like two scavengers arriving at a feast, completely unaware that they were the main course. "I am glad you decided to be reasonable," Lauren Bradley said, leaning back and resting his ankle casually on his knee. "I knew you would eventually see the strategic value of keeping this dispute out of the public eye." "My client is ready to resolve this matter today," Silas added, adopting a booming, theatrical voice clearly meant to intimidate. "We have prepared a comprehensive settlement agreement that ensures my client receives the equitable treatment he is legally owed as a biological parent. We are operating under the strict assumption that you wish to avoid a protracted, highly publicized custody battle that could severely damage your corporate brand." Andre walked slowly from the window and took his seat beside me. He did not open a laptop. He did not pull out a legal pad. He simply looked at Silas with an expression of profound, chilling amusement. "Let us dispense with the amateur courtroom monologues," Silas Andre commanded, his deep baritone instantly lowering the temperature in the room. "You requested this mediation to present your terms. The clock is ticking. Present them. Silas bristled at this dismissal, but quickly opened his briefcase, pulling out a stapled packet of paper. He slid it across the smooth granite toward Andre. My client is a devoted father who suffered extreme financial and emotional hardship while trapped overseas. He is now seeking to establish a stable, permanent presence in his son's life. However, a child accustomed to a multi-million-dollar lifestyle cannot be expected to visit his father in substandard living conditions. The court requires a parity of lifestyle to ensure the child does not experience psychological whiplash between households. Bradley nodded solemnly, attempting to manufacture an expression of deep paternal concern. A boy needs his biological father, Lauren, he said, staring directly into my eyes. Leo needs a male role model to guide him. I cannot provide that guidance if I am struggling to survive while you hoard a massive fortune. It is incredibly damaging to a child to see his father treated like a second-class citizen. I am asking for the bare minimum required to build a proper home for our son. I kept my facial expression completely blank. I did not blink. I did not betray a single ounce of the absolute disgust boiling in my veins. I simply waited for him to list the price tag he had placed on his non-existent relationship with my son. To ensure this parity of lifestyle, Silas declared, reading loudly from his printed document, "We are demanding the immediate purchase of a residential property in a premium school district. The property value must be no less than $800,000. The deed will be transferred exclusively into my client's name to prevent any future financial leverage or manipulative gatekeeping from your side." Bradley leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. "And I will need reliable transportation to drive Leo to his extracurricular activities. A new luxury sport utility vehicle fully paid off registered in my name. I think that is a very reasonable request for a safe family vehicle." Andre did not write any of this down. He simply gestured with his hand for them to continue. Furthermore, Silas announced, his voice swelling with greedy anticipation, to maintain the household and provide for the child's daily needs during visitation, we are requiring a mandatory tax-free monthly stipend of $40,000. This reverse child support and spousal maintenance will be deposited directly into my client's account on the first of every month. In exchange for these financial concessions, my client is willing to waive his right to a public trial and will settle for joint legal custody on paper with a highly flexible physical visitation schedule. Bradley smiled a wide, predatory grin that exposed his absolute lack of morality. "It is a win for everyone, Lauren. You get to protect your precious $68 million logistics company from a nasty media scandal. I get the resources I need to be the father Leo deserves. We sign the papers today, the money transfers by Monday, and I cancel the press conference I have scheduled for next week." The silence that followed his extortion demand was heavy and absolute. Bradley and Silas sat back, visibly radiating triumph. They honestly believed they had executed a flawless legal ambush. They had laid out their exorbitant delusional demands, fully expecting me to panic argue or attempt to negotiate the numbers down. They thought my silence was the paralyzing shock of a defeated woman. I looked at the stapled packet of demands resting on the granite table. Then I looked up at Bradley. "Are these your final, non-negotiable terms?" I asked. My voice was eerily calm, completely devoid of the panic he was so desperately searching for. Bradley exchanged a quick, arrogant glance with his sleazy attorney. "Absolutely," Bradley confirmed, puffing out his chest. "Not a single dollar less. You sign over the house, the car, and the monthly $40,000, or I walk right out of this office and drag you through the muddiest, most destructive public custody battle this city has ever seen." I turned my head slowly to look at Andre. Andre met my gaze, a cold, ruthless glint illuminating his dark eyes. The trap had been fully articulated. The extortion was officially on the record. The enemy had marched directly to the center of the execution block and proudly demanded the drop of the blade. "I think we have heard enough," I said, turning my attention back to the arrogant man sitting across from me. "Andre, please show my former husband exactly what his demands are actually worth." Andre leaned forward, his movements remarkably precise and deliberate. He did not bother reaching for a thick, disorganized briefcase like Silas. He simply picked up the single thin manila folder resting quietly in front of me on the granite table. He opened it, withdrawing a crisp piece of paper. He slid it precisely to the center of the granite table, stopping it equidistant between Silas and the increasingly arrogant Bradley. "Read it carefully," Mr. Montgomery Andre instructed, his voice ringing with absolute authority. "Read every single clause before you dare to speak another word in my conference room." Silas scoffed, adjusting his cheap tie. He picked up the paper with a dramatic sigh, preparing to launch into another rehearsed monologue. However, the moment his eyes scanned the bold legal heading at the top of the page, his mouth snapped shut. His eyes darted across the text with frantic speed. The smug grin vanished, replaced by pure panic. "What is it?" Bradley asked. "Silas, what did they give you?" Silas did not answer, completely paralyzed by the digital signature and judicial stamp. He flipped the document over, searching for a loophole to save his contingency fee. He found nothing. "Mr. Montgomery appears to have lost his voice," Andre stated. "Allow me to summarize. That document is a voluntary termination of parental rights. You executed it 9 years ago at Logan Airport in exchange for absolute immunity regarding the $48,000 you stole while my sister-in-law was bleeding on a hospital bed." Bradley blinked, the color rapidly draining from his shocked face. "What exactly are you talking about?" he stammered, his voice cracking. "I was under extreme duress. That paper means absolutely nothing. A judge will toss it out the second I explain she forced me." Andre laughed. "You underestimate my legal competence. You signed a binding, irrevocable termination that was ratified and permanently sealed by a family court judge. I filed the supporting affidavits myself, including your explicit refusal to care for a medically fragile infant. The judge permanently severed your parental rights to protect that child." Silas finally dropped the document onto the table as if it were coated in acid. "You did not tell me about this," Silas hissed at his client, trembling with furious indignation. "You sat in my office and swore you were a devoted father who was unlawfully alienated by a wealthy ex-wife. You never mentioned signing a voluntary termination." "Because it does not matter," Bradley shouted abruptly, standing up and pointing a shaking finger directly at Andre. "I am his biological father. Basic DNA proves it. You cannot just erase a father from existence with a legal technicality. I have fundamental constitutional rights to my child." "You have absolutely zero rights," Andre corrected, his voice slicing through Bradley. Us rising hysteria. "In Massachusetts, a finalized voluntary termination of parental rights is permanent and entirely irrevocable. You severed the legal tie to avoid financial liability and criminal fraud charges. From a legal standpoint, you are a complete stranger to Leo. You have the exact same parental rights as a random pedestrian walking down the street outside this building. You cannot file for joint custody. You cannot file for visitation. You cannot demand access to his educational records. You are legally a ghost." Bradley stumbled backward, his knees hitting the edge of his leather chair. He looked at Silas silently, pleading for his attorney to find a way out of the trap. Silas simply shook his head rapidly, packing his disorganized papers back into his briefcase. Silas knew a dead end when he saw one. He knew he could not extort a millionaire using a client who possessed zero legal standing. But the child support Bradley stammered, eyes wide with desperate realization. The parity of lifestyle. The court demands that a child receive support from both parents. Andre folded his hands on the table, delivering the final legal blow. Child support is an obligation tied directly to legal parentage. Because you are not a legal parent, you cannot demand reverse child support. You cannot demand alimony. You cannot demand an $800,000 house, a luxury vehicle, or a $40,000 monthly stipend. Your entire extortion plot was built on the fundamental assumption that you possessed leverage. You possess absolutely nothing. "I will go directly to the press," Bradley threatened, his voice cracking sharply as his carefully constructed house of cards collapsed entirely around him. "I will tell the news networks you manipulated a terrified, grieving father into signing away his rights. I will ruin your pristine corporate image permanently." "You are welcome to try." I finally spoke, my voice cold and steady. I watched him squirm, relishing the destruction of his confidence. "But if you take this to the press, Andre will legally unseal the affidavits. We will release the bank records, showing exactly how you stole the medical funds intended for a premature baby in the intensive care unit. We will publish the emails where you called your own child a burden. The public will not see a tragic, alienated father. They will see a cowardly thief who abandoned his family and returned 9 years later demanding a massive payout. Bradley slowly sank back into his leather chair completely and utterly defeated. The aggressive, greedy swagger was gone instantly, replaced by the hollow, terrified stare of a man who realized he had just blindly walked into a corporate firing squad. He truly had absolutely no leverage whatsoever. He had absolutely no legal standing remaining. He certainly had no son. But the execution was not over. The legal drop was merely the first phase of our counteroffensive. Bradley thought leaving empty-handed was the absolute worst-case scenario. He was about to learn that he was not walking away with nothing. He was walking away with a crushing, inescapable financial catastrophe. I quietly looked over at Andre, instantly signaling for the second, far more devastating trap to be sprung. Andre smoothly withdrew his hand from the thin manila folder containing the voluntary termination document. He reached beneath the polished granite table and retrieved the heavy black leather binder. He dropped it onto the surface with a massive echoing thud that made Bradley physically jump in his seat. The sound was the unmistakable gavel strike of absolute corporate execution. Bradley was already shaking. His chest heaved with rapid, shallow breaths as his extortion plot disintegrated. He thought he was simply leaving this mediation empty-handed. He honestly believed that walking away with $0 was the absolute worst-case scenario. He had no idea he was currently operating in the extreme negative. You came here today demanding an $800,000 house, a luxury car, and $40,000 a month, I said, standing up slowly from my chair. I buttoned my charcoal suit jacket, projecting total dominance over the room. You calculated your entire extortion strategy based on the arrogant assumption that you were a legally recognized father with leverage. I began pacing slowly down the length of the conference room, my heels clicking sharply against the hardwood floor. But since we have already firmly established that you are legally a ghost to my son, let us talk about who you actually are in the eyes of the law, Bradley. You are an unemployed, deported expatriate carrying exactly $250,000 in highly toxic delinquent debt. Bradley, us. Eyes snapped toward me wide with sudden primal fear. Silas stopped packing his briefcase, his sleazy legal mind desperately trying to comprehend how I knew the exact dollar amount of his client West Confidential financial ruin. Andre opened the heavy leather binder, flipping to the first indexed tab. $60,000 in defaulted high-interest credit cards. Andre listed his deep voice, reciting the numbers like a funeral dirge. $40,000 in predatory personal loans, secured through secondary lenders immediately after your prompt deportation from Dubai. And $150,000 in federal tax liens resulting from years of unfiled expatriate returns. That has absolutely nothing to do with you, Bradley stammered, his voice rising in panic. My personal finances are none of your business. I will declare bankruptcy. You cannot touch me. You cannot declare bankruptcy on federal tax liens. Bradley, I smiled, looking down at him with profound pity. And you certainly cannot hide from a primary creditor who holds the exclusive assigned rights to every single financial obligation you possess. Andre turned a page in the binder, revealing a stack of documents stamped with official red ink. When a debtor defaults, their liabilities do not magically disappear. They are bundled and sold on the secondary market for pennies on the dollar. Usually, these toxic bundles are purchased by massive, faceless debt collection agencies operating out of cheap call centers. On Wednesday morning, Andre continued tracing a line on the document with his gold pen. A fully licensed debt collection agency approached your specific creditors. We bypassed the typical randomized bundle purchasing process. We offered a premium upfront cash buyout to acquire the exclusive assigned rights to your exact portfolio. We bought the defaulted credit cards. We bought the predatory loans. We acquired the outsourced federal tax collection rights. Bradley looked physically sick. A sheen of cold sweat broke out across his forehead. "Who is we?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. "What agency?" "The agency is called Apex Recovery Solutions," I stated, stopping directly behind his leather chair. "It is a fully owned, heavily obfuscated subsidiary of my corporate empire. Apex Recovery Solutions operates under the umbrella of a private blind trust. The corporate entity is registered in Delaware under the name L&A Holdings. As of Wednesday afternoon, L&A Holdings legally purchased every single debt you owe." Bradley stared at the documents in the binder. He recognized his own forged signatures on the defaulted loan applications. He saw the federal transfer stamps transferring his tax debt. "We did not just buy pieces of paper," I whispered, leaning down slightly so my voice was right next to his ear. "We bought your entire financial existence." "What does that mean?" Bradley choked out, shrinking away from me. Andre leaned forward, interlacing his fingers on the granite table, thoroughly relishing the moment. "It means L&A. Holdings is your sole undisputed primary creditor. We own the legal authority to financially destroy you at a moment's notice. In the state of Massachusetts, a primary creditor holding $250,000 in validated delinquent debt possesses staggering legal remedies." I walked around the table and returned to my seat, staring directly into his terrified eyes. "We have the immediate right to petition the court for aggressive wage garnishments. If you manage to secure a minimum wage job flipping burgers, we will legally seize your paycheck before you can even buy groceries. We have the authority to execute instantaneous bank levies. If a single dollar enters any bank account bearing your name, we will freeze the account and extract the funds immediately. And most importantly," Andre added, delivering the killing blow, "we hold the absolute power to place an involuntary lien on any physical property you attempt to acquire." Bradley stopped breathing. The blood completely drained from his face as the realization hit him. "You came into this room today," I said softly, "demanding that I purchase an $800,000 house and transfer the deed directly into your name. Did you honestly think I would refuse? I was actually hoping you would sign a binding settlement agreement today. Because the very millisecond a house deed was registered in your name, Apex Recovery Solutions had the legal authority to seize it to satisfy your outstanding debt. If I handed you the keys to a mansion today, Andre would legally foreclose on it by Monday morning." Silas practically threw his remaining papers into his briefcase. He wanted absolutely no part of this corporate slaughter. He was a cheap hustler, and he had just walked into a room with financial titans. "But who is L&A Holdings?" Bradley demanded, his voice cracking with pure hysteria. "You cannot just hide behind a shell company to torture me. I will sue you for harassment. I will sue the trust." "You cannot sue a blind trust," Andre stated calmly. "And you certainly cannot sue the beneficiary." "Who is the beneficiary?" Bradley yelled, looking wildly between me and Andre. "Who actually owns the holding company?" I sat perfectly still, letting the silence build until the tension in the room was unbearable. I looked at Bradley with eyes as cold as the freezing harbor outside the window. "L&A stands for Leo and Andre," I said, my voice slicing through the room with absolute merciless precision. "Andre is the sole legal executor and the sole exclusive beneficiary of every single asset, every piece of real estate, and every collected commercial debt package inside that holding company is my 9-year-old son." The realization hit Bradley like a physical blow to the chest. He collapsed back into his chair, his jaw dropping open in silent, absolute horror. "You called him a burden," I said, every word dripping with lethal satisfaction. "You threw away your parental rights because you did not want the financial liability of a premature infant. Now, 9 years later, you are standing in my city completely bankrupt. You do not have a son, Bradley. You have a creditor. Your 9-year-old child is your sole legal master. You owe him $250,000 payable immediately upon demand." The silence in the conference room was absolute, heavy enough to crush bone. Bradley stared at me, his eyes wide and unblinking, his chest rising and falling in erratic, panicked jerks. His brain struggled to process the sheer magnitude of the trap he had walked into. He had marched into this building expecting to weaponize my child against me. Instead, he had just learned that his entire existence was legally owned by a 9-year-old boy he had discarded in a hospital room. He turned his head slowly, looking at Silas. His sleazy attorney was already standing, clutching his disorganized briefcase to his chest like a life preserver. Silas did not look at his client. He looked at Andre, terrified of the corporate shark sitting calmly across the granite table. "You cannot leave me here," Bradley croaked, his voice raw and pathetic. "Silas, do something. File an injunction. Claim this is a conflict of interest. I am formally withdrawing as your legal counsel." Silas stated, his voice trembling as he backed toward the heavy glass door. "You lied to me about your parental standing. You withheld the existence of a voluntary termination document. You exposed my firm to a massive civil liability suit from Apex Recovery Solutions. We have absolutely no attorney-client privilege left. Do not call my office. Do not step foot near my practice." Silas reached blindly behind him, pushed the glass door open, and practically sprinted down the carpeted hallway. He did not look back. Bradley was entirely alone. "You cannot do this," Bradley whispered, turning back to face me. The arrogance was completely eradicated, leaving behind a terrified, hollowed-out shell of a man. "You cannot just buy a person, us life." "We did not buy your life," Andre corrected, opening another folder from the black leather binder. "You surrendered it the moment you defaulted on your obligations. We simply acquired the legal right to collect. And since you explicitly demanded a prompt resolution today, L&A Holdings has decided to initiate the immediate collection process." Bradley flinched. "What does that mean?" "It means the grace period is over," I said, leaning forward and resting my forearms on the cool granite. "Did you honestly think we would wait for you to leave this building before we started executing the liens?" Andre slid a freshly printed document across the table. It was a court-ordered writ of execution signed and stamped by a federal judge just 2 hours prior. "While you were busy outlining your ridiculous demands for a luxury vehicle and an $800,000 house," Andre explained, "my legal team was filing an emergency motion for asset seizure. We located the bank account you opened when you arrived back in the United States. The one you used to secure the deposit on your rental sedan parked 3 blocks away." Bradley gasped, patting his jacket pockets frantically, as if checking for his wallet. "As of 20 minutes ago," Andre continued, his voice ringing with mechanical precision, "that bank account has been fully levied. The remaining balance of $412 has been frozen and seized to satisfy a fraction of the interest on your debt. Furthermore, we have contacted the rental car agency. Since your payment method is now officially frozen, your rental contract has been instantly voided. The agency is currently towing the sedan back to their lot." "You took my car!" Bradley yelled, panic finally giving way to sheer terror. "How am I supposed to leave? How am I supposed to get back to the apartment?" "You are going to walk," I replied. "Please, Lauren," Bradley begged. He dropped out of his leather chair and literally fell to his knees on the hardwood floor. He clasped his hands together, staring up at me with tears streaming down his face. "You have made your point. You won. You completely humiliated me. But you cannot leave me with absolutely nothing. I have no money. I have no car. I cannot even buy food today. Please just forgive the debt. You have millions. You do not need my money." I stood up and walked slowly around the granite table, looking down at the man kneeling on the floor. "I do not need your money," I agreed, my voice deadly calm. "But Leo does. He is a child," Bradley cried, reaching out toward the hem of my skirt. "He does not even know what a debt collection agency is." I took a sharp step backward, ensuring he could not touch me. "He does not need to know right now," I said. "All he needs to know is that his future is entirely secure. You stole $48,000 from his medical fund when he was fighting to breathe in an incubator. You left us to drown in hospital debt. Every single dollar you owe L&A Holdings will be collected. Every time you get a job, my company will garnish your wages. Every time you try to rent a nice apartment, my company will flag your credit report. Every time you try to build a new life, your son will own the very foundation you try to build it on. You are a monster, Bradley sobbed, his face buried in his hands. You are a cold, heartless monster. I am a mother, I corrected softly. And I am exactly the kind of mother you forced me to become. I looked at Andre, who was already signaling for the security team waiting outside the conference room. Two broad-shouldered guards immediately stepped through the glass doors. The mediation is officially concluded, I announced, turning my back on Bradley. Security will escort you out of the building. If you attempt to resist, they will call the police and you will be arrested for trespassing and violating an active restraining order. Lauren, please, Bradley wailed as the guards hoisted him off the hardwood floor by his arms. You cannot do this. I am his father. The guards dragged him backward toward the hallway. He kicked his feet, struggling helplessly against their iron grips, but he was completely overpowered. His pathetic cries echoed off the thick glass walls, growing fainter as they pulled him toward the executive elevators. I watched through this glass as the guards forced him into the elevator. The doors slid shut, cutting off his final desperate plea. The silence that rushed back into the conference room was beautiful. It was the sound of total, undeniable victory. Andre picked up the heavy black leather binder and placed it carefully back into his briefcase. He snapped the latches shut. The sound was sharp and definitive. The asset seizure is active across all databases, Andre reported, adjusting his suit jacket. By the time he reaches the street, his financial identity will be completely locked down. He cannot open a new line of credit. He cannot secure a standard lease. He will have to survive entirely on cash operating completely outside the modern financial system. I nodded, keeping my eyes fixed on the street below. A few minutes later, the heavy glass doors of the lobby opened. The security guards pushed Bradley out onto the freezing, wind-swept pavement. He stumbled, barely keeping his balance. He patted his pockets, completely stranded. He looked around the bustling city street, a man entirely erased from the world of power and privilege he so desperately craved. He had nothing. He was nothing. And he owed every single ounce of his nothingness to the son he had discarded. Let us go home, I said, turning away from the window. We have a robot bridge to build. Andre nodded silently, picking up his briefcase. The heavy wooden door of the conference room closed behind us, sealing away the phantom energy of the man we had just financially eradicated. We walked side by side down the long carpeted corridor toward the executive elevators. The air up here on the top floor was always perfectly climate-controlled, yet I felt a distinct, refreshing warmth radiating through my veins. The heavy, invisible armor I had worn for 9 grueling years was finally beginning to unbuckle. The brushed steel doors of the elevator slid open. We stepped inside and I pressed the button for the main lobby. The descent was rapid and smooth. I looked at my reflection in the polished metal doors. The woman staring back at me possessed a sharp, uncompromising clarity. She was not the bleeding, terrified 25-year-old girl abandoned in a hospital recovery ward. She was a corporate titan who had just executed a flawless, devastatingly precise defensive maneuver to protect her empire and her child. The elevator chimed and the doors glided open to reveal the sprawling multi-story marble lobby of the Apex Medical Logistics headquarters. The space was a monument to modern corporate architecture, flooded with natural light and echoing with the efficient hum of professionals moving about their day. However, the typical rhythm of the lobby had ground to a sudden chaotic halt. Directly in the center of the expansive marble floor near the primary security checkpoint, Bradley was actively resisting the 2 broad-shouldered guards who had escorted him down. He was twisting and thrashing his cheap gray suit jacket, slipping off his shoulders. His face was a mask of pure, unadulterated panic. Through the massive glass revolving doors at the front entrance, I could see Silas Montgomery. The sleazy attorney was practically sprinting down the icy Boston pavement, violently waving his briefcase in the air to flag down a passing taxi. Silas threw himself into the back seat of a yellow cab, slamming the door shut and speeding away, permanently abandoning his ruined client to the wolves. Bradley watched the cab disappear into the city traffic, the last ounce of his false confidence evaporating into the freezing air. He realized he was entirely isolated. He turned his head frantically, his wild eyes scanning the lobby until they locked directly onto me as I stepped out of the elevator. Lauren Bradley screamed, his voice cracking horribly as it echoed off the marble walls. Dozens of my employees, visiting hospital administrators, and corporate executives stopped exactly where they were standing. The entire lobby fell into a stunned, breathless silence, watching the chaotic spectacle unfold. With a sudden, violent jerk, Bradley managed to tear his arm away from one of the security guards. He did not run toward the exit. He ran directly toward me. The guards lunged after him, but he threw himself forward, sliding heavily across the polished marble floor until he crashed right at my feet. He dropped squarely onto his knees, his hands reaching out to grab the hem of my tailored trousers. I took a swift, calculated step backward, ensuring his grasping fingers met nothing but empty air. "Please," Bradley begged, staring up at me from the cold floor. Tears and sweat mingled on his flushed, desperate face. "You cannot let them throw me out into the street. I have absolutely nothing. I do not have a single dollar to my name. My rental car is gone. My accounts are completely frozen. You own my entire life. Please, Lauren, I am begging you. Just give me enough to get a bus ticket out of the state. Just give me a fraction of a percent of what you have." The security guards rushed forward, reaching down to haul him back to his feet. "Wait!" I commanded, raising a single hand. The guards froze instantly, stepping back, but keeping their stances wide and ready. Andre stood silently at my shoulder, an immovable sentinel watching the final act of this execution. The entire lobby held its collective breath. Everyone was watching the powerful chief executive officer deal with a weeping, pathetic trespasser kneeling at her feet. I looked down at Bradley. I did not feel a single twinge of pity. I did not feel the slightest echo of the love I had once held for the man I married. I felt absolutely nothing. The space inside my chest where my heart used to break for him was completely hollowed out, replaced by solid, unyielding titanium. "You are asking me for mercy," I said, my voice echoing clearly across the vast, silent lobby. "You are begging for a financial handout from the exact same woman you left to drown in over $100,000 of medical debt. You are asking for compassion from the mother of the premature child you explicitly called a burden." "I was wrong," Bradley sobbed, his chest heaving as he stared up at me with wide, terrified eyes. "I was stupid and young and terrified, but I am still a human being. You cannot just erase me from existence. You cannot just leave me to starve." "You erased yourself 9 years ago," I stated, my tone devoid of any emotion. "You signed a legal document severing your ties to my family because you wanted to enjoy the luxury of Dubai without the inconvenience of a sick infant. You made a calculated, greedy choice. Now the mathematics of your choices have simply balanced out." "Lauren, I am on my knees," he wailed, burying his face in his hands. "And my son was on a ventilator," I replied, cutting through his manufactured grief with razor-sharp precision. "I spent years scrubbing my hands raw, working 80-hour weeks, and sacrificing every ounce of my youth to ensure my child survived the wreckage you left behind. I built an empire from the $14 you left in our bank account. You do not get to return a decade later, demand a piece of the fortress you refused to help build, and then cry when you are crushed by the gates." I signaled to the guards with a sharp nod. "Get him out of my building. If he causes any further disruption, have the local precinct arrest him for criminal trespassing." The guards did not hesitate. They grabbed Bradley by the arms, hauling him forcefully off the marble floor. He did not fight back this time. The absolute freezing finality in my voice had broken whatever fight he had left in him. His legs went limp, and the guards practically dragged his dead weight toward the revolving glass doors. He did not shout my name again. He simply wept, a hollow, pathetic sound that faded as the heavy doors pushed him out into the bitter winter wind. I turned my back on the entrance, entirely dismissing the sight of him stumbling onto the icy pavement. I looked around the lobby. The employees and visitors were staring at me with a mixture of absolute awe and profound respect. They had just witnessed a masterclass in corporate and personal boundaries. I smoothed the lapels of my charcoal jacket, holding my head high. I walked toward the private underground parking garage, Andre matching my confident stride. The air outside was freezing, but the future waiting for me was impossibly bright. I had a massive company to run, a brilliant son to raise, and a robot bridge to build. The past was finally completely dead. The echoing click of my heels against the polished concrete of the private underground parking garage was the only sound accompanying us. The frigid air of the lower level bit at my cheeks, but the pristine, armored domestic sport utility vehicle waiting in my reserved spot represented absolute safety. Andre unlocked the doors with a swift press of his key fob. We climbed inside the heavy doors, shutting with a vault-like thud that instantly sealed out the noise of the city above. Andre started the engine, the powerful motor humming to life. He did not immediately shift the vehicle into drive. Instead, he took a deep breath, resting his hands on the leather steering wheel, and turned to look at me. The ruthless, predatory corporate lawyer who had just systematically dismantled a man in a glass conference room was entirely gone. In his place sat the warm, fiercely protective man who had paid my rent when I was a terrified 25-year-old mother. "You did it," Lauren Andre said, his voice thick with genuine emotion. "You completely excised the infection. He will never, ever cast a shadow over this family again." I leaned my head back against the leather headrest, closing my eyes for just a fraction of a second. "I did not do it alone," I replied, looking over at the man who had been more of a father to my son than Bradley could ever comprehend. "We did it." Andre smiled, shifting the vehicle into gear, and we drove up the concrete ramp, merging seamlessly into the chaotic flow of the Boston afternoon traffic. The ride to the suburbs was peaceful. I watched the gray, frozen cityscape blur past my tinted window, feeling the last remaining ounces of toxic adrenaline flush out of my system. The absolute finality of the confrontation had left me feeling remarkably light. 35 minutes later, the heavy iron gates of my property swung open automatically, recognizing the encrypted signal from the vehicle. We pulled up the long, curving driveway, flanked by towering evergreen trees that shielded the property from the outside world. Before Andre even cut the engine, the heavy oak front door of my house pushed open. Rebecca stood on the porch wrapped in a thick knit cardigan, the porch lights casting a warm golden glow against the encroaching winter dusk. She did not wait for me to walk up the steps. She hurried down the stone path, wrapping her arms around me the second my feet hit the driveway. "Is it over?" Rebecca asked, pulling back to search my face, her eyes shining with protective anxiety. "It is completely over," I confirmed, squeezing her hands. "He is a ghost. He has absolutely no money, no leverage, and no legal standing. The holding company owns his debt, and he has been permanently evicted from our reality." Rebecca let out a massive, shaky sigh of relief, pulling me into another fierce embrace. "I am so incredibly proud of you," she whispered into my shoulder. We walked inside the house together, peeling off our winter coats. The air smelled of roasted garlic and fresh herbs. The home was impeccably clean, warm, and vibrating with an energy of total security. I walked past the kitchen and turned toward the sunken living room. Leo was sitting cross-legged on the thick plush rug. Surrounding him was a sprawling, highly complex array of motorized structural components, interlocking gears, and miniature hydraulic pumps. He held a small tablet in his left hand, running lines of diagnostic code, while his right hand carefully adjusted the tension on a suspended suspension cable. He was entirely in his element, a brilliant mind orchestrating order out of chaos. I stood in the doorway, simply watching him. This was the child Bradley had called a burden. This was the boy who was supposed to ruin my life, tie me down, and drain my resources. Instead, he was the absolute architect of my survival. He was the reason I had fought with the ferocity of a cornered animal to build an empire. Leo looked up, his dark eyes immediately locking onto mine. He set the tablet down and scrambled to his feet. "Mom," he announced, his face breaking into a bright, genuine smile. "I recalibrated the weight distribution algorithm for the primary support pillars. The bridge can now sustain 30% more kinetic force without compromising the structural integrity." "That is incredible, sweetheart," I said, dropping to my knees right there on the edge of the rug, completely disregarding my expensive tailored suit. I opened my arms, and he rushed into them, wrapping his arms around my neck. I held him tightly, burying my face in his dark hair, breathing in the scent of childhood innocence and safety. He was solid, healthy, and perfectly secure. Andre walked into the living room, rolling up the sleeves of his expensive dress shirt and loosening his tie. "Move over, structural engineer," Andre joked, dropping down onto the rug next to the bridge model. "Let your uncle see if you calculated the wind shear resistance correctly. I bet I can find a vulnerability in your code." Leo laughed, a bright, joyous sound that filled the entire house. "You can try, Uncle Andre, but my mathematics are flawless." I sat back on my heels, watching the two of them instantly dive into the complex robotics project. Rebecca walked in from the kitchen, handing me a glass of red wine, and sat on the sofa behind us. I looked at the three of them. The brilliant boy, the fiercely protective sister, and the brilliant lawyer who had stood between us and total ruin. This was my family. Blood creates relatives, but loyalty, sacrifice, and showing up in the darkest, most terrifying moments of life create a family. Bradley had relied on a biological technicality to demand a multi-million-dollar payout. He had fundamentally misunderstood the currency of our household. We did not trade in genetics. We traded in unyielding absolute devotion. I had spent my 20s running from the shadow of medical debt and the trauma of abandonment. I had built a $68 million corporate fortress to ensure my child would never feel the cold sting of poverty. But sitting on the floor of my living room, watching Leo explain variable load dynamics to the man who actually acted like his father, I realized the empire was not the money. The empire was this exact moment, the peace, the safety, the undeniable reality that we had won. Sometimes the most devastating insults are the exact blueprints you need to build your kingdom. They call you a burden. They call you worthless. They leave you bleeding and broke, expecting you to quietly fade away into the statistics of failure. But they drastically underestimate the terrifying, unstoppable force of a person who has absolutely nothing left to lose. You take their cruelty, you synthesize it into pure ambition, and you build a reality so massive and untouchable that it legally crushes them the second they try to return. Have you ever taken the worst betrayal of your life and weaponized it into your greatest success? Have you ever had to build a chosen family when the one you trusted walked away? Tell me your story in the comments below. I read every single one. If you found power in this journey, hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and share this with someone who needs to be reminded that rock bottom is just the foundation for a skyscraper. Never apologize for protecting your peace, and never ever negotiate with a ghost. The story of Lauren's rise from absolute devastation to unimaginable success offers a profound lesson on resilience. The most painful betrayals can serve as the strongest foundation for our greatest triumphs. When faced with the ultimate abandonment, left physically vulnerable, financially ruined, and holding a fragile newborn, it would have been easy to succumb to despair. Instead, Lauren transformed that agonizing cruelty into high-octane fuel to survive. This narrative teaches us that our absolute lowest moments do not define our capacity for future success. In fact, hitting rock bottom strips away illusions and leaves us with clarity. Lauren did not waste her precious energy seeking revenge in the immediate aftermath. She focused entirely on survival, grinding through sleepless nights to build a secure fortress for her son. Her eventual victory over her ex-husband was not born of petty vindictiveness, but of cold, calculated preparation and the unyielding protection of her new empire. Furthermore, the story beautifully illustrates that we are not bound by the family we lose, but empowered by the family we intentionally choose to build. Her exceptional brother-in-law and sister stood in the gap where her husband failed, proving that genuine loyalty is forged through actions, not mere obligations. The betrayal she suffered forced her to establish ironclad boundaries, ensuring her peace was never compromised again. Ultimately, the severe trauma that was meant to break her became the exact blueprint she used to build an untouchable kingdom. We all face moments where we feel discarded, abandoned, or underestimated. The ultimate choice is whether we let that destruction bury us, or if we use those very bricks to build something undeniably spectacular and lasting forever. Transform your deepest pain into your greatest power and begin actively constructing your own untouchable fortress.